Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through one of medieval England's most extraordinary and controversial reigns, that of King John. Known to history as England's most hated monarch, we'll softly explore the complete life of this remarkable ruler, from his childhood as the forgotten youngest son, nicknamed Lackland, through his catastrophic loss of the French Empire that had defined his family for generations, his bitter spiritual exile as an excommunicated king cut off from Christendom itself, and finally to that fateful meadow called Runnymede, where his failures unknowingly created one of the most important documents in the story of human Britain, freedom, Magna Carta. This is a tale of ambition and failure, of tyranny and constitutional triumph, of how one man's desperate quest for power ultimately gave birth to principles of limited government and the rule of law that continue to shape our world today. From the monastery walls of Fontevrault to the political battlegrounds of medieval England, from the loss of Normandy to the creation of Magna Carta, we'll discover how England's most despised king inadvertently became one of the greatest champions of human liberty. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a gentle comment about what fascinates you most about this pivotal moment in history, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from the turbulent 13th century lull you into restful sleep. Tonight, we journey through nearly 4 hours of medieval intrigue, constitutional crisis, and the birth of democracy itself. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. John, later known as King John of England, entered this world during the holy season of Christmas in the year 1166. The precise location of his birth remains shrouded in the mists of time. Some chronicles place it near the great city of London, while others suggest the scholarly town of Oxford. What we know with certainty is that this child, born during the most sacred time of the Christian calendar, would grow to become one of medieval England's most controversial rulers. John was the 8th and final child born to his remarkable parents, and the 5th son to survive to manhood. His arrival completed a family that would reshape the political landscape of Western Europe for generations to come. The newborn prince entered a world far different from our own, a realm where power flowed not through elected parliaments, but through the complex web of feudal obligations, where kings ruled by divine right, yet constantly faced challenges from ambitious nobles, and where the boundaries between kingdoms shifted like shadows with each military campaign. The child's father was Henry II of England, a man whose very presence commanded attention across the known world. Born on the 5th day of March in 1133, Henry possessed a restless energy that would drive him to create one of medieval Europe's most extensive empires. He was the eldest son of Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, who held sway over the fertile lands of Anjou, Maine, and Touraine in what we now call France. Through his father's line, Henry inherited not just lands but the fierce determination of the Angevin dynasty, a family that seemed destined to rule through force of will and strategic brilliance. Yet it was through his mother's lineage that Henry gained his most extraordinary inheritance. His mother was Matilda, daughter of Henry I of England and granddaughter of William the Conqueror himself. When Henry I died in 1135, Matilda should have inherited the English throne as his sole legitimate heir. Instead, the English barons broke their oaths of loyalty and placed her cousin Stephen upon the throne, triggering a devastating civil war known to history as the Anarchy. For nearly 20 years, England bled as Matilda fought to reclaim her birthright. The land was ravaged by competing armies. Castles changed hands with bewildering frequency, and the common people suffered under the endless cycle of siege and counter-siege. Finally, in 1153, an agreement was reached. Stephen would remain king for his lifetime, but Henry, Matilda's son, would inherit the throne upon Stephen's death. That moment came on October 25, 1154, when Stephen breathed his last. A 19-year-old Henry crossed the Channel to claim his destiny. But Henry II was far more than simply King of England. Through his marriage in 1152 to Eleanor of Aquitaine, he had acquired vast territories in southwestern France. Eleanor herself was one of the most remarkable women of the medieval age, cultured, intelligent, and fiercely independent. Born around 1122 near the wine-rich city of Bordeaux, she was the eldest daughter of William X of Aquitaine, a man who took special pride in his precocious daughter's education. Eleanor received not just the traditional female education in household, management, and religious instruction, but was taught to read and write in Latin, a rare accomplishment for women of any social status. More unusually still, her father included her in the daily business of governing his vast duchy, allowing her to sit beside him as he heard petitions, settled disputes, and made the countless decisions required to rule effectively. When William died suddenly in 1137 during a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, 15-year-old Eleanor found herself one of the wealthiest and most eligible heiresses in all of Europe. Her inheritance was staggering in its scope and richness. The Duchy of Aquitaine stretched from the Loire Valley in the north to the Pyrenees in the south, encompassing some of the most fertile and prosperous lands in France. The duchy's wine trade alone generated enormous wealth, while its position along crucial trade routes brought customs revenues that rivaled those of kingdoms. Yet Eleanor's sudden elevation to such power also placed her in tremendous danger. A young woman controlling such vast territories would inevitably become the target of ambitious men seeking to expand their own power. Recognizing her precarious situation, Eleanor appealed to King Louis VI of France for protection. The aging king saw an opportunity, too valuable to ignore, by arranging a marriage between Eleanor and his son Louis. He could bring Aquitaine under French royal influence, while simultaneously strengthening his dynasty. The betrothal was arranged with indecent haste, and when Louis VI died soon after, the young couple found themselves crowned as Louis VII and Eleanor of France on Christmas Day, 1137. Yet this marriage, arranged for political convenience, proved to be a disaster of epic proportions. Louis VII was a man of deep, almost obsessive piety, who had originally intended to take monastic vows and spend his life in prayer and contemplation. His sudden elevation to the throne forced him to abandon his spiritual calling, but he never truly embraced the worldly responsibilities of kingship. Where Eleanor was cultured and sophisticated, Louis was austere and ascetic. Where she delighted in the refined pleasures of court life, poetry, music, intellectual discourse, he preferred the simple rituals of religious observance. The fundamental incompatibility between husband and wife became painfully apparent during the Second Crusade. Eleanor accompanied Louis to the Holy Land, but their relationship deteriorated dramatically amid the stress and hardships of the campaign. Rumors began to circulate about Eleanor's conduct, including whispered suggestions of an inappropriate relationship with her uncle, Raymond of Antioch. Whether these rumors had any basis in fact remains unknown, but they reflected the growing distance between the royal couple. The marriage produced 2 daughters, Marie and Alex, but no male heir. In an age when royal marriages existed primarily to produce sons who could inherit the throne, this was a fundamental failure that cast doubt on the union's divine blessing. Both Eleanor and Louis grew increasingly convinced that their marriage was contrary to God's will, and church authorities agreed to investigate the possibility of an annulment. In March 1152, after 15 years of marriage, the Council of Bouvines formally declared the union null and void on the grounds that Louis and Eleanor were related within the prohibited degrees of kinship. They were third cousins, a relationship the Church deemed too close for lawful marriage. The annulment freed Eleanor to remarry, but it also created a dangerous situation. As an unmarried duchess controlling vast territories, she once again became an irresistible target for ambitious nobles throughout France. Eleanor wasted no time in securing her position. Just 8 weeks after her marriage to Louis VII was dissolved, she married Henry, Duke of Normandy, in a ceremony at Poitiers Cathedral. The speed of this remarriage suggests that Eleanor and Henry had been planning their union long before her annulment was finalized. Indeed, some evidence suggests they had met and been attracted to each other during Henry's visit to the French court the previous year, when he had come to pay homage to Louis VII for his Norman territories. This marriage, in May 1152, created a political earthquake that would reshape the map of Western Europe. Henry already controlled Normandy through inheritance from his father, and his mother's claim brought him the throne of England. Now, through marriage to Eleanor, he added Aquitaine to his territories. When Henry became King of England in 1154, he ruled over an empire that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, a domain larger and richer than the Kingdom of France itself. The union between Henry and Eleanor proved far more successful than her first marriage. Where Louis VII had been pious and ascetic, Henry was energetic and worldly. Where Louis had disapproved of Eleanor's intellectual interests and cultural sophistication, Henry encouraged and shared them. The couple were well matched in intelligence, ambition, and political acumen. They were also remarkably fertile. Eleanor would bear Henry 8 children over the course of their marriage, creating a new generation of Angevin princes and princesses who would play crucial roles in the politics of medieval Europe. Their first son, William, was born in 1153, but died in infancy. Their second son, born in 1155, was named Henry after his father and would later be known as Henry the Young King. Richard followed in 1157, the future Richard the Lionheart, who would become one of the most famous warriors of the medieval age. Geoffrey was born in 1158 and would become Count of Brittany through marriage. After a gap of several years came Matilda in 1156, Eleanor in 1161, and Joan in 1165. Then, in the winter of 1166, Eleanor gave birth to her final child. This boy, born during the Christmas season when the Church celebrated the Nativity of Christ, was named John. He was the youngest of the surviving children by a significant margin, his nearest sibling in age. Joan was already walking and beginning to talk when John entered the world as a helpless infant. This timing of John's birth would prove to be one of the defining factors of his entire life. By the time he was old enough to understand the world around him, his father had already made provisions for his older brother's futures. The complex inheritance customs of the medieval period meant that a king had to carefully balance the competing claims of multiple sons, each of whom expected to receive substantial lands and titles appropriate to their royal birth. The society into which John was born operated according to principles that modern people find difficult to understand. There were no true nation-states as we know them today. Instead, Europe was divided into a complex patchwork of duchies, counties, and baronial holdings, each controlled by powerful leaders who owed various degrees of loyalty to their overlords. A king was essentially the most powerful baron in a given region, ruling through a combination of military might, political alliances, and the complex web of obligations known as feudalism. Medieval thinkers conceived of society as a great hierarchy, ordained by God himself. At the pinnacle stood the Almighty, followed by his representatives on earth, the Pope and the various kings and emperors. Below them came the great nobles, dukes, counts, and barons, who held vast estates and commanded the loyalty of lesser knights. The knights themselves formed another tier, warrior aristocrats who had sworn oaths of loyalty to their lords in exchange for grants of land. Below them came the common people, the peasants, artisans, and merchants whose labor supported the entire system. This hierarchy was not merely social but also legal and economic. Each level owed specific obligations to those above and could expect certain protections and privileges in return. A peasant bound to the land could not leave his lord's estate without permission, but in exchange he could expect protection in time of war and access to the lord's courts for justice. A knight owed military service to his lord for a specified number of days each year, but in return received a grant of land sufficient to support himself and his family in appropriate dignity. For women, the medieval world offered far fewer opportunities than it did for men. Most women of all social classes found their lives defined by their relationships to powerful men as daughters, wives, or widows. Marriage was typically arranged by families for political or economic advantage, with little regard for personal preference. Only women connected to powerful men through marriage or birth, or those who entered religious life as nuns, could hope to exercise any significant influence on the events of their time. John's mother, Eleanor, was one of the remarkable exceptions to this general rule. Her vast inheritance and strong personality allowed her to play a role in politics that few women of her era could match. She had commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and ruled territories in her own right. For her sons, she would serve not just as a mother, but as a political advisor and, when necessary, a military ally. Her influence on John's upbringing and later career cannot be overstated. The world of John's childhood was also experiencing dramatic changes that would reshape medieval society. Population was growing rapidly across Europe, creating new pressures and opportunities. Towns were expanding as trade networks stretched across increasingly vast distances. New agricultural techniques were bringing more land under cultivation, while technological innovations were revolutionizing everything from warfare to architecture. The intellectual life of the period was equally dynamic. The great universities were beginning to take shape, first at Bologna in Italy, then at Paris in France. Scholars were rediscovering the works of ancient Greek philosophers through translations from Arabic, leading to new synthesis of Christian theology and classical learning. Gothic architecture was transforming the landscape as soaring cathedrals rose in cities across Europe, their pointed arches and flying buttresses seeming to reach toward heaven itself. These changes created both opportunities and challenges for rulers like Henry II. The growing wealth of society meant greater resources for royal government, but it also created new tensions as different groups competed for influence and privilege. The development of more sophisticated administrative techniques allowed kings to govern more effectively, but it also raised expectations about royal justice and competence. It was into this complex and rapidly changing world that John was born. In December 1166, as the youngest son of one of Europe's most powerful rulers, he could expect a life of privilege and comfort, but his path to real power and authority would be far from certain. The medieval principle of primogeniture, inheritance by the eldest son, meant that his older brothers would inherit the bulk of their father's territories. John would need to carve out his own place in the world through a combination of luck, skill, and ruthless determination. Being the fifth son in a royal family brought both advantages and disadvantages. On the positive side, John would receive an excellent education and would be surrounded by some of the most capable administrators and military leaders of his generation. He would learn statecraft from watching his father govern one of medieval Europe's most complex political entities. He would witness diplomacy, warfare, and administration at the highest levels. But being the youngest also meant being overlooked and underestimated. Resources that might have been devoted to preparing John for rule were instead focused on his older brothers, who had more obvious claims to inherit significant territories. The nickname that would follow John throughout his life, Lackland, reflected this reality. Unlike his brothers, who received substantial inheritances while still young, John would be forced to wait and hope that circumstances might eventually provide him with territories appropriate to his royal birth. The contrast with his brothers was stark. Henry, the young king, as the eldest surviving son, was clearly destined to inherit England and Normandy. He was given a magnificent ceremonial coronation in 1170, while still a teenager, to reinforce his status as heir apparent. Richard, with his obvious military talents and commanding presence, was granted Aquitaine, the duchy he would rule through his mother's inheritance. Geoffrey received Brittany through marriage to its heiress. Each of John's older brothers had a clear path to power and a defined role in their father's empire. John, by contrast, seemed almost an afterthought. Henry II would sometimes refer to him jokingly as John Lackland, a nickname that began as paternal teasing but would eventually become a cruel reminder of his marginal status. The joke reflected a real problem. There simply weren't enough major territories in the Angevin of an empire to provide all of Henry's sons with inheritances befitting their royal status. Yet this apparent disadvantage may have had some unexpected benefits for John's development. Freed from the immediate pressures of preparing to rule specific territories, he was able to receive a broader and more thorough education than his brothers. While Henry the young king was learning the specific skills needed to govern England and Normandy, and Richard was mastering the military arts that would make him one of the most famous warriors of his generation, John was developing a deep understanding of law, administration, and finance that would serve him well in later life. The childhood years that John spent at the monastery of Fontevraud were particularly formative. This remarkable institution, founded by the charismatic preacher Robert of Arbrissel around 1101, was unlike any other religious house in medieval Europe. Most monasteries were strictly segregated by gender, but Fontevraud housed both men and women in a single community. Even more unusual, the abbey was governed by an abbess rather than an abbot. The women supervised the men rather than the reverse. This arrangement reflected Robert of Arbrissel's revolutionary belief that women were spiritually equal to men and equally capable of religious leadership. His preaching had attracted followers from all social classes, but he was particularly successful in appealing to noble women who found few opportunities for intellectual and spiritual fulfillment in the broader society. By the time John arrived at Fontevraud, the abbey had become one of the most prestigious religious houses in France, renowned for the quality of its education and the sophistication of its intellectual life. For the Angevin royal family, Fontevraud held special significance. Eleanor's family had been patrons of the abbey for generations, and it was considered their spiritual home. The abbey's location near Chinon, one of the Angevin's most important castles, made it a natural choice for the education of royal children. The monks and nuns of Fontevraud could provide young princes and princesses with an education that combined religious instruction with the practical skills needed for aristocratic life. John was not abandoned at Fontevraud. Rather, he was placed in an environment where he was surrounded by people who functioned as an extension of his immediate family. The abbey's royal connections meant that its residents were accustomed to dealing with the children of kings and nobles. They understood the unique challenges and opportunities that came with royal birth. and they could provide guidance that went far beyond simple religious instruction. The education John received at Fontevraud was remarkably comprehensive for its time. He learned to read and write in both Latin and French, skills that were far from universal, even among the nobility. Latin was the language of the church, of scholarship, and of international diplomacy. Fluency in Latin opened access to the vast library of classical and Christian texts that formed the foundation of medieval learning. French was the language of the aristocracy throughout much of Western Europe, essential for anyone who hoped to participate in the political and cultural life of the nobility. But John's education extended far beyond basic literacy. The monastery's library contained works on astronomy and geography that gave him an understanding of the physical world far more sophisticated than most of his contemporaries possessed. He studied biology and agriculture, learning about the natural processes that governed everything from human health to crop yields. Medical texts introduced him to the pharmaceutical properties of various plants and minerals, knowledge that would prove useful in an age when the boundary between medicine and poison was often unclear. John also developed a lifelong fascination with gemstones and precious metals. This interest went beyond mere aesthetic appreciation in the medieval world. Gems and precious metals were repositories of value that could be easily transported and converted into ready cash when needed. A king who understood the properties and relative values of different stones and metals possessed knowledge that could prove crucial in times of financial crisis. The intellectual foundation John received at Fontevraud was supplemented by his reading in philosophy and literature. He studied the works of classical authors like Pliny the Elder, whose natural history provided a comprehensive survey of ancient knowledge about the natural world. He read the theological works of St. Augustine, whose City of God offered a Christian interpretation of history and politics that profoundly influenced medieval thought. The writings of Hugh of St. Victor introduced him to the latest developments in scholastic philosophy and theology. Perhaps most importantly for his later career, John developed a deep appreciation for the intellectual challenges of governance. Unlike his brothers, who were trained primarily as warriors and ceremonial figures, John learned to see rulership as a complex intellectual puzzle requiring mastery of law, finance, diplomacy, and administration. This analytical approach to power would distinguish his reign from those of his predecessors, though it would also contribute to his reputation for cold calculation rather than inspiring leadership. The monastery also provided John with recreational pursuits appropriate to his aristocratic status. He became an accomplished chess player, a game that was considered excellent training for the strategic thinking required in warfare and politics. Chess taught patience, foresight, and the ability to think several moves ahead, skills that would prove invaluable in the complex political maneuvering of medieval court life. John also developed a passionate love of hunting that would remain with him throughout his life. In the medieval world, hunting was far more than simple recreation. It was considered essential training for warfare, teaching skills in tracking, archery, and horsemanship that translated directly to military applications. Hunting also provided opportunities for informal diplomacy, as nobles often conducted important business while pursuing game through forests and countryside. Yet even as John received this comprehensive education, he remained somewhat removed from the center of family politics. His older brothers were already beginning to play active roles in governing their father's territories, learning statecraft through direct participation in the business of rule. John, by contrast, remained in the somewhat artificial environment of the monastery, observing the world of politics from a distance rather than participating directly in its complexities. This distance may have contributed to certain aspects of John's personality that would later cause him difficulties as king. Having spent his formative years in the controlled environment of the monastery, he may have developed an overly theoretical understanding of power that failed to account for the messy realities of human nature and political emotion. His later tendency to treat governance as an intellectual exercise to be solved through careful analysis rather than inspirational leadership may have had its roots in these childhood experiences. When John was 12 years old, his education took a new turn. Henry II decided that his youngest son had received sufficient monastic education and should now learn the practical skills of governance and administration. The king arranged for John to enter the household of Ranulph de Glanville, one of the most capable and trusted members of the royal administration. Glanville was far more than simply a court official. He was one of the most influential men in England, serving as Henry II's justiciar or chief minister. In the king's absence, Glanville effectively ruled England, making decisions about taxation, justice, and administration that affected millions of people. He was also a legal scholar of considerable reputation, having written a treatise titled On the Laws and Customs of England that codified many of the legal innovations introduced during Henry II's reign. Living in Glanville's household provided John with an education that no monastery could offer direct exposure to the daily workings of royal government at the highest level. He observed how decisions were made about taxation and expenditure, how legal disputes were resolved, how military campaigns were planned and financed. He learned the intricate details of financial administration, understanding how money flowed from the countryside to the royal treasury and how it was then deployed to support the various activities of government. Perhaps most importantly, John learned from Glanville how the machinery of government could be manipulated to serve the interests of those who controlled it. Glanville was undoubtedly a capable administrator who served Henry II loyally and effectively, but he was also a man who understood how to use his position to advance his own interests and those of his family and allies. John absorbed these lessons carefully, developing a sophisticated understanding of how power actually worked beneath the formal structures of medieval government. This practical education in the realities of power complemented the theoretical knowledge John had gained. He began to understand how the abstract principles of law and governance played out in practice, how personal relationships and financial incentives shaped political decisions, how the threat of force lurked behind even the most civilized diplomatic negotiations. Yet there were also troubling aspects to the education John received in Glanville's household. He learned not just how to use power effectively, but how to abuse it when necessary. He observed how the legal system could be manipulated to serve political ends, how financial pressure could be used to coerce compliance, how the threat of imprisonment, or worse, could silence opposition. These lessons would serve him well as king, but they would also contribute to his reputation for cruelty and arbitrary rule. The contrast between John's education and that of his brothers was becoming increasingly apparent. While Henry the young king was learning to be a ceremonial monarch, and Richard was developing into one of the finest military commanders of his generation, John was becoming an expert in the unglamorous but essential business of actually running a government. His brothers might inspire loyalty and fear on the battlefield, but John was learning how to manipulate the levers of power that actually determined who won and lost in the long run. This difference in preparation would have profound consequences for their later careers. When Richard became king, he would prove to be a magnificent warrior, but a largely absent ruler, spending most of his reign on crusade or fighting in France, while others managed the daily business of government. John, by contrast, would be intimately involved in every aspect of royal administration, personally reviewing financial accounts, hearing legal cases, and making decisions about matters that other kings delegated to subordinates. As John moved through his teenage years, the question of his future inheritance remained unresolved. His father had experimented with various schemes to provide him with appropriate territories, but none had yet come to fruition. The abortive betrothal to Alice of Maurienne had collapsed when the young heiress died. Attempts to carve out a kingdom for John in Ireland had foundered on the practical difficulties of establishing effective control over that turbulent land. The uncertainty surrounding John's future was symptomatic of a larger problem facing the Angevin Empire. Henry II had created a vast collection of territories stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. But this empire lacked the institutional structures needed to hold it together permanently. Each territory retained its own laws, customs, and traditions. The Norman aristocracy had little in common with the Gascon nobles of Aquitaine, who in turn shared few interests with the Anglo-Saxon peasantry of England. The empire was held together, primarily by the personal authority and energy of Henry II himself. As long as he remained vigorous and active, constantly traveling between his various territories and personally resolving the countless disputes that arose, the system functioned reasonably well. But what would happen when Henry died? Could his successors maintain control over such a diverse and far-flung collection of territories? The question became more pressing as Henry's sons reached maturity and began to develop their own ambitions and interests. Each prince naturally focused on the territories he expected to inherit, developing relationships with local nobles and learning the specific skills needed to govern effectively in his assigned region. But this process also meant that they were growing apart from each other, developing separate identities and interests that might conflict when their father was no longer present to mediate between them. Henry the young king, despite his ceremonial coronation, remained frustrated by his lack of real authority. Richard was building a power base in Aquitaine that was increasingly independent of his father's control. Geoffrey was establishing himself in Brittany through marriage and military success. Only John remained without a clear role or inheritance, a situation that created both opportunities and dangers. On one hand, John's lack of established territories meant that he remained more dependent on his father than his brothers, potentially making him a more reliable ally in family disputes. On the other hand, his uncertain position created incentives for him to pursue risky schemes that might provide him with the inheritance he felt he deserved. The tension between Henry II and his sons was exacerbated by the complex feudal relationships that governed their territories on the continent. Technically, Henry II was not an independent monarch in France, but rather a vassal of the French king for his various duchies and counties. This meant that the French king had both the right and the duty to intervene in disputes between Henry and his sons, a situation that French kings were eager to exploit to weaken their overly powerful vassal, King Louis VII of France. Eleanor's former husband had been relatively unsuccessful in his attempts to break up the Angevin Empire, but he had succeeded in creating a template that his successors would follow. By supporting rebellious Angevin princes against their father, French kings could hope to fragment Henry's territories and bring them under more direct French control. The strategy reached its culmination in 1173, when Henry the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey all rose in rebellion against their father, supported by Louis VII and Eleanor herself. The revolt was triggered by Henry II's attempt to arrange a marriage between John and the heiress of Maurienne, which would have required giving John control of several important castles that his older brothers considered part of their own inheritances. The rebellion of 1173 to 1174 revealed both the fragility of the Angevin Empire and the exceptional military and political skills of Henry II. Despite being outnumbered and facing enemies on multiple fronts, Henry managed to defeat the coalition arrayed against him through a combination of rapid movement, strategic alliances, and sheer determination. The revolt collapsed when Henry captured Eleanor, who had been coordinating the rebellion from her power base in Aquitaine. Yet the successful suppression of the rebellion came at a significant cost. Henry was forced to make substantial concessions to his sons in order to restore peace, grants that reduced his own authority and created precedents for future disputes. More seriously, the revolt had demonstrated that the Angevin Empire could not survive determined opposition from both the French king and rebellious Angevin princes acting in concert. For young John, the rebellion had several important consequences. First, his loyalty to his father during the crisis elevated his status within the family. While his older brothers had taken up arms against Henry II, John had remained steadfastly loyal, earning his father's gratitude and trust. This loyalty would be rewarded with increased favor and attention in the years that followed. Second, the rebellion taught John important lessons about the nature of power and loyalty in the medieval world. He observed how quickly allies could become enemies and how personal relationships were constantly subordinated to political calculation. He learned that trust was a luxury that rulers could rarely afford, and that even family bonds were subject to political pressures. Finally, the rebellion impressed upon John the importance of having secure financial resources and military forces that were personally loyal to him rather than bound by feudal obligations that might be called into question. During times of crisis, these lessons would profoundly influence his later policies as king, particularly his reliance on mercenary forces and his aggressive taxation policies designed to maintain a full royal treasury. As the 1170s progressed, John gradually took on more prominent roles in his father's government. He was no longer the forgotten youngest son, but rather Henry II's most trusted ally within the family. This new status brought both opportunities and dangers. Opportunities to gain experience and authority, but dangers from older brothers who increasingly saw him as a threat to their own positions. The competition between John and his brothers intensified as it became clear that Henry II was beginning to favor his youngest son over his older children. Part of this favoritism may have been simply personal. John had remained loyal during the Great Rebellion, while his brothers had betrayed their father's trust. But there were also practical reasons for Henry's preference. John had received the most comprehensive education in governance and administration of any of his sons. He was also the most flexible and adaptable, lacking the rigid territorial commitments that limited his brothers' usefulness in managing the empire as a whole. This favoritism created a volatile family dynamic that would have tragic consequences in the years to come. Henry the young king grew increasingly resentful of his father's refusal to grant him real authority despite his ceremonial coronation. Richard chafed at any suggestion that John might receive territories that he considered part of his own inheritance. Geoffrey pursued his own ambitious schemes in Brittany, while maintaining an opportunistic attitude toward family loyalties. As John approached his 20th birthday, he remained the only one of Henry's sons without a clearly defined inheritance or role. This situation was obviously unsustainable. A prince of royal blood could not remain indefinitely without appropriate territories and authority. Henry II would soon be forced to make decisions about John's future that would reshape the political balance within the Angevin family and have far-reaching consequences for the future of the empire itself. The stage was set for the final act of Henry II's reign, a period of escalating family conflict that would end with the old king's death and John's unexpected emergence as a serious contender for the throne. The education and experiences of his youth had prepared him well for the challenges that lay ahead, though not even Henry II could have foreseen the extraordinary circumstances that would eventually make his youngest son King of England, as we prepare to explore John's rise to power in our next episode. We leave him at this crucial juncture, a young man of exceptional education and growing political sophistication, favored by his father but resented by his brothers, still seeking the inheritance that would allow him to prove himself worthy of his royal birth. The boy who had once been dismissed as John Lackland was about to embark on a journey that would make him one of the most controversial rulers in English history. The year 1199 dawned with the Angevin Empire, seemingly secure under the mighty hand of Richard the Lionheart. Few could have predicted that before the spring flowers had fully bloomed, the entire political landscape of Western Europe would be transformed by a single crossbow bolt fired from the walls of an obscure castle in the heart of France. Richard had spent the winter months of 1198 to 1199 engaged in the endless cycle of warfare that had consumed most of his reign. Since returning from the Third Crusade, he had devoted himself almost entirely to defending and expanding his continental territories against the persistent encroachments of Philip Augustus, King of France. The two monarchs had developed a relationship of mutual respect and bitter rivalry, each recognizing in the other a worthy adversary in the great game of medieval politics. The immediate cause of their latest conflict was a dispute over treasure, Allegedly, discovered by a peasant on the lands of the Viscount of Limoges. According to the story that reached Richard's ears, a laborer working in a field had unearthed a cache of golden figures that depicted a king and his family seated around a table. The discovery was reported to Ademar V, Viscount of Limoges, who, as feudal lord, could claim ownership of any treasure found on his territory. Richard, however, asserted that as overlord of the region, he was entitled to the greatest share of any such discovery. When Ademar refused to surrender more than a token portion of the find, Richard responded with characteristic directness. He gathered his forces and marched to besiege Calashobrol, the castle where the treasure was reportedly being held. The siege that began in March 1199 seemed routine by the standards of Richard's career. Calashobrol was not a particularly strong fortress, and its garrison was small. Richard had successfully besieged dozens of similar castles over the years, and there was little reason to expect this operation to be any different. The Lionheart himself took an active role in the siege work, personally inspecting the defenses and directing the placement of siege engines. On the evening of March 25, 1199, Richard was conducting his usual reconnaissance of the castle walls, when a crossbow bolt, fired by a defender named Pierre Bozel, struck him in the shoulder. Initially, the wound did not appear life-threatening. Richard withdrew to his tent, where his personal physician attempted to remove the bolt. However, the iron point had lodged deep in the bone, and the physician's efforts to extract it only worsened the injury. Over the following days, the wound became infected. In an age before antibiotics or proper understanding of sanitation, even minor injuries could quickly become fatal if bacteria entered the bloodstream. Richard's condition deteriorated rapidly as gangrene set in. Recognizing that his death was imminent, the king summoned his closest advisors to make final arrangements for the succession and the governance of his vast territories. The question of who would inherit Richard's throne was far from straightforward. Under the principle of primogeniture that was gradually becoming established in Western Europe, the crown should have passed to the eldest male heir of the deceased king. Since Richard had no legitimate children, this meant looking to the next generation of the royal family for a suitable candidate. The strongest claimant by bloodline was Arthur of Brittany, the posthumous son of John's older brother, Geoffrey. Arthur had been born after his father's death in 1186, making him only about 12 years old in 1199. His youth was both an advantage and a disadvantage. On one hand, he posed no immediate threat to established power structures, but, on the other hand, he would require a regency government that could create opportunities for ambitious nobles to manipulate. royal authority. Arthur's claim was complicated by questions about the relative rights of uncles versus nephews in royal succession. Medieval law provided little clear guidance on such matters, and different regions had different customs and precedents. Norman law tended to favor inheritance by the surviving sons of a dead king, while the customs of Anjou and Brittany were more likely to recognize the claims of a deceased elder son's children. John, as Richard's only surviving brother, had a strong claim based on proximity of blood and his position as an adult male capable of immediately assuming the responsibilities of kingship. He also possessed several practical advantages that would prove crucial in the succession struggle. Most importantly, he was already in a position of significant authority within the Angevin government, having served as his father's most trusted lieutenant during the final years of Henry II's reign and maintaining that role under Richard. John also enjoyed the support of several key figures, whose backing would be essential for any successful claimant. William Marshal, often regarded as the greatest knight of his generation, and a man whose loyalty to the Angevin dynasty was beyond question, declared his support for John's claim. Hubert Walter, the Archbishop of Canterbury and one of the most capable administrators in the kingdom, also endorsed John's succession. Perhaps most crucially, John had his mother Eleanor's formidable political skills working on his behalf. Despite being nearly 80 years old, Eleanor remained one of the most influential political figures in Western Europe. Her vast network of alliances, accumulated over decades of involvement in the highest levels of international politics, gave her resources that neither Arthur nor his supporters could match. Eleanor moved with remarkable speed and decisiveness in the immediate aftermath of Richard's death, while others were still absorbing the news of the king's passing. She was already implementing a comprehensive strategy to secure John's succession. She understood that in the fluid political situation following a king's death, initiative and rapid action could be more important than legal niceties or theoretical claims. The first priority was securing John's position in Aquitaine, the duchy that Eleanor had brought to the Angevin Empire through her marriage to Henry II. As the hereditary Duchess of Aquitaine, Eleanor retained significant personal authority in the region, and she used this influence to rally support for John among the Gascon and Poitevin nobility. Her personal presence in the region served as a powerful symbol of continuity and legitimacy that helped convince local nobles to accept John as their new overlord. Simultaneously, Eleanor worked to neutralize support for Arthur's claim in the regions where it was strongest. Arthur's position was most secure in Brittany, where he could count on the loyalty of the Breton nobility who saw him as their natural leader. However, his support in other areas was more tentative, depending largely on the political calculations of nobles who might be willing to change sides if John could offer them better terms. Eleanor's diplomatic skills proved invaluable in this regard. She understood the complex web of personal relationships, family connections, and financial interests that determined noble loyalties in the medieval world. Through a combination of promises, threats, and appeals to honor and tradition, she managed to prevent many potential supporters of Arthur from openly declaring their allegiance to the young duke. While Eleanor secured the southern portions of the empire, John himself moved to consolidate his position in the north. His first objective was Rouen, the capital of Normandy and the symbolic heart of the Angevin continental empire. Control of Rouen would give him access to the ducal treasury and the administrative apparatus that governed Normandy, while also sending a clear message about his determination to claim his inheritance. John's march to Rouen was a calculated risk. If Arthur's supporters had been better organized or more decisive, they might have intercepted him during this vulnerable period, when he was moving with only a small force through potentially hostile territory. However, The speed of his movement and the confusion following Richard's death worked in his favor. By the time Arthur's supporters could mobilize effective opposition, John had already reached Rouen and secured the loyalty of its garrison. The ceremony in which John was invested as Duke of Normandy was carefully staged to emphasize the legitimacy of his claim and the continuity of Angevin rule. The great nobles of Normandy were summoned to Rouen to pay homage to their new duke, creating a public display of support that would be difficult for them to later repudiate. John received the ducal regalia, the sword ring and banner, that symbolized his authority in a solemn ceremony that invoked both legal precedent and divine sanction. With Normandy secured, John's next priority was reaching England to claim the royal crown. The English throne was perhaps the most valuable prize in the entire succession dispute, both for its intrinsic wealth and power and for the legitimacy that came with being an anointed king. Arthur's supporters had not seriously attempted to challenge John's position in England, partly because the young duke had no significant connections there, and partly because the practical difficulties of mounting a cross-channel invasion were formidable. John's crossing to England was accomplished without incident, and he landed at a kingdom that seemed remarkably peaceful given the recent death of its king. This stability was largely due to the effective administration that had been maintained during Richard's long absences. Hubert Walter's management of the kingdom during the Crusade and the subsequent continental wars had proven that England could function smoothly even without the physical presence of its monarch. The coronation ceremony at Westminster Abbey on May 27, 1199, was designed to be both magnificent and pointedly traditional. By following the established rituals of royal coronation and emphasizing his connection to the long line of English kings stretching back to William the Conqueror, John sought to present his reign as a natural and inevitable continuation of existing political arrangements, rather than a revolutionary change. Hubert Walter, as Archbishop of Canterbury, performed the coronation ceremony with all the solemnity and splendor that the occasion demanded. The presence of England's leading nobles and churchmen served as visible proof of their acceptance of John's kingship. The ceremony concluded with the traditional acclamation by the assembled crowd, a ritual that symbolically represented the consent of the English people to their new monarch's rule. Yet, even as John celebrated his successful claim to the English throne, the broader political situation remained far from settled. Arthur retained control of Brittany and could count on the support of many nobles in Maine and Anjou who remained unconvinced that John's claim was superior to that of Geoffrey's son. More ominously, Philip Augustus of France had begun to signal his support for Arthur's cause, seeing an opportunity to exploit the Angevin succession dispute to advance his own territorial ambitions. Philip's position in this dispute was particularly complex because of his role as feudal overlord of the Angevin continental territories. Technically, both John and Arthur owed homage to the French king for their duchies and counties in France, which gave Philip both the right and the responsibility to adjudicate between their competing claims. This feudal relationship, which had been a source of tension throughout the reigns of Henry II and Richard I, now became a potential weapon in Philip's hands. The French king's initial response to the Angevin succession crisis was characteristically cautious and calculating. Rather than immediately declaring support for either claimant, Philip invited both John and Arthur to his court to present their cases. This apparent neutrality allowed him to extract concessions from both sides, while maintaining his freedom to support whichever candidate would better serve French interests. John understood that gaining Philip's recognition was crucial for the long-term stability of his position. Without the French king's approval, he would face constant challenges to his authority in the continental territories, making effective governance impossible. However, he also realized that Philip's support would come at a price that might undermine the very territories he was seeking to secure. The negotiations between John and Philip Augustus during the summer and autumn of 1199 were among the most complex and consequential diplomatic discussions of the medieval period. Both men were experienced negotiators who understood the high stakes involved. Philip sought to use the succession dispute to extract territorial concessions and acknowledgements of French suzerainty that would permanently weaken the Angevin Empire. John, meanwhile, tried to minimize these concessions while securing the recognition he needed to consolidate his rule. The initial meetings between the two kings took place in a series of carefully choreographed encounters that reflected the complex relationship between feudal lord and vassal. When John traveled to meet Philip, he came not as an independent monarch, but as a duke seeking confirmation of his holdings from his overlord. This ritual acknowledgement of subordination was deeply humiliating for a man who ruled territories larger and richer than those of his nominal superior, but it was also legally necessary under the feudal system. Philip's demands during these negotiations revealed the extent of his ambitions for expanding French royal authority. He insisted on homage not just for Normandy, Anjou and Aquitaine, the traditional Angevin holdings in France, but also for England itself. This demand was both legally questionable and practically impossible for John to accept, since it would have made him a vassal for his royal crown and undermined the independence that English kings had maintained since the Norman conquest. The territorial concessions that Philip demanded were equally problematic. He insisted on the return of the Vexin, the strategically crucial border region between Normandy and the French royal domain that had been fortified by Richard I with the mighty castle of Château Galliard. Philip also demanded significant portions of Normandy's eastern frontier and sought to establish French garrisons in key Angevin fortresses. John's response to these demands demonstrated both his political acumen and the fundamental weakness of his position. He understood that accepting Philip's terms would fatally compromise his ability to defend the continental territories, but he also recognized that outright rejection might provoke immediate French military intervention on Arthur's behalf. His solution was to engage in protracted negotiations that delayed any final resolution while he worked to strengthen his position through other means. During this period of diplomatic maneuvering, John also moved to consolidate his support among the Angevin nobility through a combination of rewards for loyalty and punishments for opposition. Those nobles who had quickly declared their support for his claim received confirmations of their existing holdings and grants of new lands and privileges. Those who had supported Arthur or remained neutral found their positions less secure, facing challenges to their titles and increased financial obligations to the crown. This policy of selective rewards and punishments was typical of John's approach to governance throughout his reign. Unlike his brother Richard, who inspired loyalty through personal charisma and military success, John sought to control his nobility through careful manipulation of incentives and penalties. This approach could be highly effective in the short term, but it also created resentments that would eventually contribute to the baronial rebellions of his later reign. The question of Arthur's fate during this period was a source of constant concern for John and his advisors. The young duke remained at liberty in Brittany, where he continued to assert his claim to the Angevin inheritance and to seek support from nobles who might be dissatisfied with John's rule. As long as Arthur remained alive and free, he would serve as a focus for opposition to John's authority and a potential tool for French manipulation. John's initial approach to the Arthur problem was relatively restrained. Rather than attempting to capture or eliminate his nephew immediately, he sought to isolate him politically and undermine his support base. This strategy included diplomatic efforts to convince Arthur's mother, Constance of Brittany, to abandon her son's claim in exchange for guarantees of Breton autonomy under John's overlordship. However, these diplomatic efforts were complicated by the complex political situation in Brittany itself. The Breton nobility had a long tradition of resistance to external authority, and they viewed Arthur not just as their rightful duke, but as a symbol of Breton independence. Any agreement that subordinated Arthur to John's authority would be seen as a betrayal of Breton interests and would likely provoke rebellion. The delicate balance of the succession dispute was fundamentally altered by John's decision to marry Isabella of Angoulême in August 1200. This marriage, which seemed like a minor diplomatic arrangement at the time, would ultimately trigger the chain of events that led to the loss of the Continental Empire and John's transformation from successful claimant to embattled king. John's matrimonial situation in 1199 was already complicated by his existing marriage to Isabella of Gloucester, which had been arranged by his father Henry II as part of his efforts to provide appropriate inheritances for his younger sons. The marriage had brought John significant lands and revenues, but it had also created problems that became more serious as his political position improved. The most immediate issue was that John and Isabella of Gloucester were closely related. They were first cousins, a relationship that the Church considered too close for lawful marriage without a special papal dispensation. Henry II had apparently obtained such a dispensation, but its validity was questionable, and the marriage had never been fully accepted by all Church authorities. More seriously, from a political standpoint, the marriage had produced no children. After more than a decade, in an age when royal marriages existed primarily to produce heirs who could continue dynastic lines, this failure was interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure. John's position as king made the production of male heirs essential for the stability of his reign and the future of the Angevin dynasty. The annulment of John's marriage to Isabella of Gloucester was accomplished with surprising ease, suggesting that the Church authorities were as eager to resolve the questionable union as John himself. The official grounds for the annulment were consanguinity, the couple's close blood relationship, but political considerations almost certainly played a role in the Church's willingness to cooperate. With his first marriage dissolved, John was free to seek a new wife who could provide both political advantages and the prospect of male heirs. His choice of Isabella of Angoulême reflected both personal preference and strategic calculation. Isabella was young, probably only about 12 years old at the time of their marriage, but she was already recognized as one of the great beauties of her generation. More importantly, from a political perspective, she was the sole heiress to the county of Angoulême, a strategically vital territory that controlled key routes between John's northern and southern continental domains. The county of Angoulême occupied a crucial position in the geography of the Angevin Empire. Located in the heart of Aquitaine, it controlled the routes that connected the northern territories of Poitou and Anjou with the southern regions of Gascony and the Pyrenea frontier. Any army seeking to move between these areas would need to pass through Angoulême or face lengthy detours through difficult terrain. By marrying Isabella, John would gain control of these strategic routes, while also adding the county's substantial revenues to his treasury. The marriage would also strengthen his position in Aquitaine, where some nobles remained uncertain about their loyalty to a king who had spent most of his life in England and Normandy, rather than in their region. However, John's marriage plans created an immediate and serious problem. Isabella was already betrothed to Hugh IX of Lusignan, known as Hugh the Brown, one of the most powerful nobles in Poitou. The Lusignan family had been major players in the politics of Western France for generations, controlling extensive territories and maintaining a network of alliances that made them nearly independent of outside authority. The betrothal between Isabella and Hugh the Brown had been arranged by their families as part of a complex web of alliances, designed to maintain the balance of power in Poitou. The marriage would have united two of the region's most important noble houses and created a power block that could serve as a counterweight to royal authority. For the Lusanians, the marriage represented an opportunity to add Angoulême's strategic territories to their existing holdings and further consolidate their position as the dominant family in Poitou. John's decision to marry Isabella himself, thereby breaking her existing betrothal, was both legally questionable and politically provocative. Medieval marriage law recognized that formal betrothals created binding obligations that could not be lightly set aside. By marrying a woman who was already pledged to another man, John was violating established legal and social norms in a way that would inevitably provoke retaliation. The political implications of this action were even more serious than the legal issues. The Lusignan family had extensive connections throughout Poitou and Aquitaine, including kinship ties with many of the region's most important noble houses. Hugh the Brown's brother, Raoul of Exarden, controlled territories along the sensitive eastern frontier of Normandy, where his defection could open dangerous gaps in the Angevin defensive system. John's marriage to Isabella took place on August 24, 1200, at the Cathedral of St. Pierre in Angoulême. The ceremony was conducted with appropriate royal magnificence, but the haste with which it was arranged reflected John's awareness of the political dangers he was creating. By moving quickly to formalize the union, he hoped to present his enemies with a fait accompli that would be difficult to reverse. The immediate reaction to John's marriage was everything he might have feared. Hugh the Brown and his family were outraged by what they saw as a deliberate insult to their honor and a violation of established agreements. Their anger was shared by many other Poitevin nobles who viewed John's action as an example of royal high-handedness that threatened the traditional rights and privileges of the regional aristocracy, rather than attempting to mollify the Lusignians. Through compensation or diplomatic concessions, John responded to their complaints with characteristic arrogance. When Hugh the Brown demanded satisfaction for the injury done to his family's honor, John dismissed his concerns and made it clear that he considered the matter closed. This response demonstrated John's fundamental misunderstanding of the political dynamics in his continental territories. Unlike England, where royal authority was well established and the nobility generally accepted the king's right to make unilateral decisions, the continental territories retained much of their traditional autonomy. Local nobles expected to be consulted on matters that affected their interests, and they retained the option of appealing to higher authorities, including the King of France, if they felt their rights were being violated. The Lusignan family's decision to appeal to Philip Augustus was both legally justified and politically inevitable. Under the complex feudal relationships that governed medieval France, vassals who felt wronged by their immediate overlords had the right to seek justice from higher authorities in the feudal hierarchy. Since John held his continental territories as a vassal of the French king, Philip had both the legal authority and the political motivation to hear the Lusignans' complaints. Philip Augustus's response to the Lusignan appeal demonstrated his skill as a political opportunist. Rather than immediately ruling in favor of either party, he summoned John to appear before his court to answer the charges brought against him. This summons placed John in an impossible position. If he appeared, he would be acknowledging Philip's authority to judge his actions as a sovereign king. If he refused, he would be providing Philip with legal justification for more aggressive action. John's decision to ignore Philip's summons was understandable but ultimately disastrous. As a king in his own right, he found the idea of answering to another monarch for his personal conduct deeply humiliating. He also suspected, probably correctly, that Philip had already decided to rule against him regardless of the merits of the case. However, his refusal to appear gave Philip the legal pretext he needed to declare John in violation of his feudal obligations. The formal process by which Philip stripped John of his continental territories followed established feudal law, but was unprecedented in its scope and consequences. In January 1202, Philip's court declared that John had failed in his obligations as a vassal by refusing to answer his overlord's summons. As punishment for this failure, all of John's fiefs held from the French crown were declared forfeit and were granted instead to Arthur of Brittany. This legal maneuver accomplished several objectives for Philip Augustus. It provided him with a seemingly legitimate basis for military action against the Angevin territories, since he was now acting to enforce a lawful court decision rather than pursuing naked territorial aggrandizement. It also united the disparate opposition to John's rule under a single banner by giving Arthur a legal claim to all the continental territories rather than just Brittany. The war that followed Philip's court decision was unlike the previous conflicts between the Angevin and Capetian dynasties. Earlier wars had been essentially border disputes between rival powers seeking to expand their influence in contested regions. This new conflict was a war of succession in which the very existence of the Angevin continental empire was at stake. John's initial response to the crisis demonstrated both his military capabilities and his political limitations. When he learned that Arthur and his supporters were besieging Eleanor at the castle of Mirabeau in Poitou, he organized one of the most spectacular military operations of his career, covering nearly 80 miles in just 48 hours. John's forced march to Mirabeau was a masterpiece of medieval logistics that caught his enemies completely by surprise. The Battle of Mirabeau on August 1st, 1202, was a complete victory for John's forces. Arthur was captured, along with most of the leading rebels, including Hugh the Brown and Geoffrey of Lusignan. The castle was relieved, and Eleanor was rescued from what had appeared to be a desperate situation. For a brief moment, it seemed that John had decisively resolved the succession crisis and secured his continental inheritance. However, John's treatment of his prisoners after the victory at Mirabeau revealed the character flaws that would ultimately doom his reign. Rather than following the established customs of medieval warfare, which required that high-born prisoners be treated with honor and eventually ransomed or exchanged, John subjected his captives to harsh and degrading conditions that violated every norm of chivalric conduct. The prisoners were chained together and transported in carts, like common criminals, rather than being allowed to travel with the dignity appropriate to their noble status. Many were imprisoned in the dark dungeons of Norman castles, where they were denied adequate food and medical care. Some chroniclers reported that 22 of the captured nobles died in John's prisons, apparently from deliberate neglect or abuse. This treatment of prisoners was not merely cruel, but politically catastrophic. Medieval warfare operated according to established rules that reflected the shared values of the warrior aristocracy. These rules recognized that today's enemies might be tomorrow's allies, and that the treatment of prisoners should reflect the common humanity of the noble class. By violating these norms, John alienated not only his current enemies, but also potential supporters who were horrified by his conduct. The scandal of John's treatment of his Mirabeau prisoners spread throughout Western Europe, damaging his reputation and providing his enemies with powerful propaganda weapons. Stories of noble prisoners dying in chains in royal dungeons confirmed every negative stereotype about John's character and convinced many previously neutral nobles that he was unfit to rule. More immediately damaging was the effect of John's conduct on William de Roches, one of the most important nobles in Anjou and a key supporter of John's cause. De Roches had played a crucial role in the victory at Mirabeau and expected to be consulted about the treatment of the prisoners, when John ignored his advice and proceeded with his harsh policies. Desroches felt publicly humiliated and withdrew his support from the royal cause. The defection of William Desroches triggered a cascade of similar decisions by other Angevin nobles who concluded that John could not be trusted to respect their rights and privileges. Within months of his great victory at Mirabeau, John found himself facing a renewed rebellion that was larger and more dangerous than the original uprising. The most serious consequence of John's misconduct after Mirabeau was its effect on the fate of Arthur of Brittany. The young duke's capture had presented John with both an opportunity and a dilemma. As long as Arthur remained alive, he would continue to serve as a focus for opposition to John's rule. However, any action taken against a captive who was both a close relative and a fellow prince would be subject to intense scrutiny from the entire European political community. John's initial approach to the Arthur problem was relatively restrained. The young duke was held in comfortable captivity at the castle of Falaise in Normandy, where he was treated with the respect due to his royal birth. John appears to have hoped that Arthur might be persuaded to abandon his claims in exchange for appropriate compensation, perhaps a substantial pension and lands in England, where he could live in honourable retirement. However, Arthur refused all offers of compromise, maintaining his claim to the entire Angevin inheritance and demanding his immediate release. His stubbornness may have been influenced by his youth and inexperience, but it may also have reflected advice from supporters who believed that time was on their side. As long as Arthur remained alive and unreconciled to John's rule, he would continue to represent a legitimate alternative that discontented nobles could rally around. The growing pressure from Arthur's supporters, combined with John's own increasing desperation as the military situation deteriorated, appears to have convinced the king that more drastic action was necessary. In early 1203, Arthur was transferred from Falaise to Rouen, where he would be under John's direct control rather than in the hands of potentially unreliable subordinates. What happened next remains one of the great mysteries of medieval history, but the most credible accounts suggest that John personally murdered his nephew in a fit of drunken rage. According to the annals of Margam Abbey, John had captured Arthur and kept him alive in prison for some time in the castle of Rouen. When John was drunk, he slew Arthur with his own hand, and tying a heavy stone to the body, cast it into the Seine. Whether this account is literally accurate or not, Arthur of Brittany disappeared from history in the spring of 1203, and contemporary observers had little doubt about what had happened. The young duke's death eliminated John's most dangerous rival, but it also provided his enemies with a propaganda weapon of enormous power. The murder of a captive relative was considered one of the most heinous crimes possible in medieval society, violating not only the laws of war, but also the fundamental bonds of kinship that held the aristocratic world together. News of Arthur's death spread rapidly throughout the Angevin territories, creating a wave of revulsion that severely damaged John's remaining support. Nobles who had been wavering in their loyalties were pushed into open opposition by their horror at the king's conduct. The Breton nobility, in particular, were outraged by the murder of their young duke and threw their full support behind Philip Augustus's war effort. Philip Augustus was quick to exploit the propaganda opportunities presented by Arthur's death. He portrayed himself as the champion of justice, seeking to punish a kinslayer and usurper, while presenting his territorial ambitions as a righteous effort to restore legitimate authority to the Angevin lands. This moral dimension to the conflict made it much easier for Philip to attract support from nobles who might otherwise have been reluctant to take sides in what appeared to be a purely dynastic dispute. The military situation began to deteriorate rapidly for John during the summer and autumn of 1203. Philip's forces launched a systematic campaign to capture the key fortresses that anchored the Angevin defensive system in Normandy and Anjou, unlike previous French offensives, which had often been limited in scope and duration. This campaign was clearly designed to achieve permanent territorial conquest rather than temporary advantage. John's response to this crisis revealed both his strategic limitations and his increasingly erratic judgment. Rather than concentrating his forces for a decisive confrontation with Philip's main army, he divided his attention between multiple theatres and frittered away his military resources in indecisive skirmishing. His frequent changes of plan and apparent inability to develop a coherent defensive strategy confused his own supporters and encouraged his enemies. The most serious blow to John's position came with the beginning of the siege of Château Galliard. In August 1203, this massive fortress, built by Richard I at enormous expense to guard the eastern approaches to Rouen, was considered the key to the defense of Normandy. If Château Galliard fell, the road to the Norman capital would be open, and the entire duchy would be at Philip's mercy. Richard had spared no expense in making Château Galliard virtually impregnable. The castle was built on a commanding height, overlooking the Seine River, with 3 successive lines of defense that an attacker would have to overcome. The outer ward protected the approaches to the main fortress, while the middle ward contained accommodations for a large garrison. The inner keep, built of the finest cut stone and equipped with the latest innovations in military architecture, was designed to serve as a final refuge that could hold out indefinitely even if the outer defences were breached. The siege of Château Galliard became a test of wills between Philip Augustus and the Angevin system of defence. Philip understood that capturing the fortress would require enormous resources and careful planning, but he also recognized that success would effectively end Angevin resistance in Normandy. John, meanwhile, was faced with the agonizing choice between concentrating all his available forces for the relief of Château Galliard or trying to maintain his position in his other territories. John's decision to attempt the relief of Château Galliard in the winter of 1203 to 1204 was strategically sound but tactically flawed. The plan called for a coordinated attack combining land and river, forces that would break the French siege lines and allow reinforcements to reach the beleaguered garrison. However, the operation was overly complex for the capabilities of medieval armies, and poor coordination between the different elements of the attacking force led to failure. The failure of the relief attempt was a devastating blow to John's prestige and to the morale of his remaining supporters. If the king could not protect the most important fortress in Normandy, how could he be expected to defend the smaller castles and towns that formed the backbone of the duchy's defense? The psychological impact of the failed relief was as damaging as its military consequences. In December 1203, John made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He abandoned Normandy and returned to England. This retreat was presented as a temporary measure designed to gather resources for a more effective campaign, but contemporaries understood it as an admission of defeat. A king who fled his territories in the face of enemy advance could no longer command the loyalty and respect necessary for effective resistance. John's departure from Normandy had immediate and catastrophic consequences. The Norman nobility, faced with the choice between a king who had abandoned them and a conqueror who was present and victorious, began to submit to Philip Augustus in increasing numbers. The defection of key nobles accelerated the collapse of the remaining Angevin strongholds and made organized resistance impossible. See Château Galliard finally fell to Philip's forces on March 6, 1204, after a siege that had lasted more than 6 months. The capture of Richard's beautiful daughter marked the end of effective Angevin resistance in eastern Normandy and opened the road to Rouen. The garrison's heroic defense had bought time for John to organize a relief effort, but that time had been wasted in futile preparations that came to nothing. The fall of Rouen on June 24, 1204, marked the end of the Angevin Empire in northern France. Philip Augustus entered the Norman capital in triumph, formally incorporating the duchy into the French royal domain and ending nearly 150 years of Anglo-Norman rule. The revenues of Normandy, which had been crucial to the financial stability of the Angevin monarchy, now flowed into Philip's treasury instead of John's. The loss of Normandy was followed by the rapid collapse of John's position in Anjou and Poitou. Without the Norman strongholds to anchor their northern flank, the remaining Angevin territories were indefensible against Philip's advancing armies. By the end of 1204, John had lost virtually all of his continental inheritance, except for a portion of Aquitaine in the far south. The magnitude of these territorial losses was unprecedented in the history of the Angevin dynasty. Henry II had built his empire through careful diplomacy, strategic marriages, and military conquest over the course of several decades. John had lost the bulk of it in less than 2 years through a combination of political miscalculation, military incompetence, and moral failure. The human cost of these defeats was enormous. Thousands of Norman and Angevin nobles found themselves forced to choose between their traditional loyalties to the English crown and their practical need to accommodate themselves to French rule. Many families were torn apart as some members chose to remain loyal to John while others submitted to Philip Augustus. The economic disruption caused by the constant warfare devastated the countryside and brought hardship to countless peasants and townspeople who had no voice in the political decisions that determined their fate. For John personally, the loss of his continental empire was both a political disaster and a profound psychological trauma. The territories he had lost were not merely strategic assets, but the ancestral homeland of his family. Anjou had been the original seat of Angevin power, while Normandy represented the foundation of English royal authority on the continent. To lose these lands was to sever the connection between the English crown and its continental origins. The speed and completeness of the collapse also reflected poorly on John's abilities as a military commander and political leader. While Richard I had successfully defended the same territories against Philip Augustus for years, John had lost them in a remarkably short period, despite inheriting substantial resources and experienced administrators. The comparison between the two brothers inevitably favored Richard and reinforced John's reputation as an inferior ruler. The financial implications of the territorial losses were equally serious. The continental territories had provided a substantial portion of the Angevin monarchy's revenues through taxes, feudal dues, and customs revenues. Normandy alone had contributed resources equivalent to about 1/3 of the English royal income. The loss of these revenues would force John to extract more money from his remaining territories, creating fiscal pressures that would contribute to the eventual rebellion of his English barons. Perhaps most seriously, the loss of the continental empire fundamentally altered the strategic situation facing the English monarchy. For more than a century, English kings had been primarily continental rulers who happened to also rule England. Their main interests, their closest advisors, and their primary military concerns had all been focused on their French territories. England had been valuable mainly as a source of revenues and manpower to support continental ambitions. Now, John found himself in the unprecedented position of being primarily an English king with only limited continental interests. This transformation required him to develop new approaches to governance and new relationships with his English subjects. However, John's temperament and training had prepared him for the role of a continental prince, not an insular English monarch. His attempts to adapt to his new circumstances would create tensions that would ultimately contribute to the constitutional crisis of his later reign. The immediate aftermath of the territorial losses also created diplomatic challenges that John was ill-equipped to handle. Philip Augustus was now clearly the dominant power in Western Europe, with resources and territories that dwarfed those of any potential rival. This shift in the balance of power forced other European rulers to recalculate their alliances and commitments, often in ways that were disadvantageous to English interests. John's relationship with the papacy was also complicated by his territorial losses. The Pope had traditionally sought to maintain a balance between the major European powers, preventing any single ruler from becoming too dominant. The collapse of Angevin power in France upset this balance and potentially gave Philip Augustus dangerous influence over papal policies. John would need to work carefully to maintain papal support while rebuilding his military and political position. The loss of the continental territories also had profound implications for the development of English national identity. During the Angevin period, the English nobility had maintained extensive cross-channel connections, with many families holding lands on both sides of the sea. The territorial losses forced these families to choose between their English and continental interests, often leading them to abandon their continental properties and focus exclusively on their English holdings. This process of forced choice gradually created a more distinctly English aristocracy with fewer continental connections and more focused attention on English affairs. While this development would ultimately contribute to the emergence of a stronger English national identity, in the short term it created resentments and tensions as noble families adjusted to their reduced circumstances and altered prospects. The psychological impact of the territorial losses on John himself should not be underestimated. Throughout his youth and early adulthood, he had been trained to see himself as the heir to a great continental empire. His education, his personal relationships, and his political ambitions had all been shaped by the expectation that he would eventually rule territories stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. The sudden reduction of his domain to England and a small portion of Aquitaine represented not just a political setback, but a fundamental challenge to his sense of identity and purpose. John would spend the remaining 12 years of his reign attempting to reverse these losses, and his obsession with continental recovery would drive many of the policies that ultimately led to his conflict with his barons and the creation of Magna Carta. The broader European political situation also changed dramatically as a result of John's territorial losses. Philip Augustus had emerged as the clear winner in the long struggle between the Capetian and Angevin dynasties, and his success encouraged other rulers to challenge established power structures. The Holy Roman Empire was entering a period of internal conflict that would weaken its ability to check French expansion, while the papal imperial conflict created opportunities for French influence in Italian affairs. These broader changes in the European balance of power would have profound implications for the development of medieval civilization. The emergence of France as the dominant Western European power would influence everything from architectural styles to literary traditions. The weakening of cross-channel political connections would contribute to the gradual divergence of English and continental political institutions. For contemporary observers, the collapse of the Angevin Empire was one of the most dramatic political events of their lifetimes. Chroniclers struggled to understand how such a mighty political structure could have disappeared so quickly and completely. Some attributed the disaster to divine judgment on John's sins, particularly the murder of Arthur. Others focused on John's personal failings as a military commander and political leader. Modern historians have generally been more sympathetic to John's position, recognizing that he faced structural problems that might have defeated any ruler. The Angevin Empire had always been an artificial construction held together primarily by the personal authority of strong rulers. The feudal obligations that theoretically united the various territories provided little real cohesion when faced with determined opposition from the French monarchy. The loss of popular support that followed Arthur's murder was perhaps the most crucial factor in John's defeat. Medieval warfare depended heavily on the cooperation of local nobles who controlled the castles and commanded the loyalty of local populations. Once John lost the confidence of these crucial intermediaries, no amount of military skill or financial resources could compensate for their defection. Philip Augustus's diplomatic and military skills also played a crucial role in the Angevin collapse. Unlike his predecessors, who had often been content with limited territorial gains, Philip pursued a systematic strategy designed to permanently eliminate Angevin power in France. His willingness to invest enormous resources in extended sieges like that of Chateau Galliard demonstrated a level of commitment that John was unable to match. The technological and tactical developments of the period also favored the French position. Improvements in siege warfare had made even the strongest castles vulnerable to determined attack, while the increasing use of mercenary forces gave advantages to rulers with deeper financial resources. Philip's ability to maintain professional armies in the field for extended periods eventually overcame the defensive advantages that had previously protected Angevin territories. As 1204 drew to a close, John faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding his position from a drastically weakened base. He retained the wealthy Kingdom of England and a portion of Aquitaine, resources that were still substantial by medieval standards. However, he had lost the territories that had been the heart of his family's power for generations, and he had acquired a reputation for military incompetence and political unreliability that would make future diplomatic and military efforts more difficult. The stage was now set for the next phase of John's reign, a period in which he would attempt to recover his lost territories through a combination of financial innovation, diplomatic alliance building, and military preparation. These efforts would ultimately fail, but they would also create the domestic tensions that led to the baronial rebellion and the creation of Magna Carta. The transformation of John from a successful claimant to the throne into a defeated and discredited ruler had taken place with remarkable speed. In 1199, he had seemed to have successfully navigated the complex challenges of royal succession and established himself as the legitimate heir to Angevin power. By the end of 1204, he had lost the bulk of his inheritance and earned a reputation as one of the least successful military commanders of his generation. This dramatic reversal of fortune reflected both the inherent instability of medieval political arrangements and the crucial importance of personal reputation and perceived competence in maintaining royal authority. John's failures had created a downward spiral in which each defeat made future success less likely by undermining confidence in his leadership and encouraging further defections from his cause. As we prepare to explore the next phase of John's reign in our following episode, we leave him at perhaps the lowest point of his career, a king without an empire, a ruler whose reputation had been shattered by military defeat and moral failure. Yet John would prove to be remarkably resilient, and his efforts to rebuild his position would create new conflicts and challenges that would ultimately reshape the relationship between the English monarchy and its subjects. The boy who had once been called Lackland had indeed lost his lands, but he had also gained something unexpected, a kingdom that would force him to confront the fundamental questions about the nature of royal authority and the limits of monarchical power. These confrontations would ultimately produce Magna Carta, one of the most important constitutional documents in human history. The winter of 1204 to 1205 found John in a position that would have broken lesser men. Stripped of the continental empire that had been his family's pride for generations, he now ruled from the cold, grey walls of English castles, plotting his return. two lands that seemed increasingly distant with each passing month. Yet rather than accept his reduced circumstances, John would spend the next decade pursuing an obsessive campaign to restore his lost inheritance, a campaign that would ultimately cost him far more than the territories he sought to regain. The immediate challenge facing John was both simple and overwhelming. How could he, as King of England alone, hope to defeat Philip Augustus, who now commanded the vast resources of an expanded French kingdom? The answer, John believed, lay in the systematic exploitation of every possible source of revenue and military strength within his remaining territories. If he could not match Philip's resources directly, he would compensate through superior organization, innovative taxation, and careful alliance-building. This strategy required a fundamental transformation in the nature of English royal government. Previous Angevin kings had ruled primarily as feudal overlords, depending on the traditional obligations of their vassals for military service and financial support. John, faced with the need to raise unprecedented sums of money and maintain professional armies for extended periods, would be forced to develop new forms of royal authority that pushed the boundaries of accepted practice. The financial innovations that John introduced during this period were remarkable for their sophistication and ruthless efficiency. Working with a cadre of professional administrators who shared his obsession with bureaucratic detail, he created new forms of taxation that extracted revenue from previously untapped sources. The traditional feudal aids and reliefs that had sufficed for earlier kings were supplemented by innovative levies on movable goods, commercial transactions, and even the inheritance of widows. John's approach to forest law exemplified his systematic exploitation of royal prerogatives. The royal forests, which covered perhaps 1/3 of England, were governed by special regulations that allowed the king to impose heavy fines for violations of hunting rights, unauthorized clearing of land, or unauthorized construction. Under previous kings, forest law had been enforced sporadically and often with considerable flexibility. John, however, saw the forests as a vast source of untapped revenue and ordered systematic investigations designed to identify and punish every possible violation. The forest heirs, or judicial investigations, that John commissioned were marvels of administrative thoroughness and popular oppression. Teams of royal officials descended on forest communities with detailed records of past violations and comprehensive knowledge of obscure regulations that had often been ignored for generations. Peasants who had cleared small plots for cultivation, nobles who had built unauthorized mills or fish ponds, and merchants who had constructed roads without royal permission, all found themselves facing heavy fines that could bankrupt their families. The human cost of these financial policies was enormous, but John viewed such concerns as luxuries he could not afford. Every penny extracted from his subjects brought him closer to the day when he could field an army capable of reconquering Normandy and Anjou. The suffering of individual families was a price he was willing to pay for the greater goal of restoring Angevin greatness. John's taxation of the Jewish communities of England revealed both his financial desperation and his willingness to exploit the vulnerable for political gain. Medieval Jews occupied a precarious position in Christian society, enjoying royal protection in exchange for serving as sources of credit and revenue for the crown. Unlike Christian subjects, Jews had no traditional rights or established customs that limited royal demands, making them ideal targets for extraordinary taxation. The tallage of 1210, which demanded the unprecedented sum of 66,000 marks from England's Jewish communities, was perhaps the most ruthless example of John's financial policies. This enormous levy, equivalent to several times the annual revenues of most European kingdoms, was collected through methods that would have been considered excessive even by medieval standards. Jewish leaders were imprisoned until their communities paid the required sums, and those who could not meet their assessments faced exile or worse. The Bristol Jew, Abraham, who initially refused to pay his assessment of 10,000 marks, became a notorious example of John's methods. According to contemporary accounts, John ordered that one of Abraham's teeth be extracted each day until he agreed to pay. After losing 7 teeth, Abraham capitulated and provided the required funds. Such stories, whether literally accurate or not, demonstrated the lengths to which John was prepared to go in pursuit of his financial objectives. These harsh taxation policies generated enormous revenues. Historians estimate that John raised more money during his reign than any previous English king. However, they also created a reservoir of resentment that would eventually explode into open rebellion. The English nobility, who had previously enjoyed considerable autonomy under absent Angevin kings, found themselves subject to unprecedented royal interference in their affairs. The transformation of England from a loosely governed feudal kingdom into a centralized fiscal state required not just new taxation policies, but also new administrative structures. John expanded the royal bureaucracy dramatically, creating new offices and procedures designed to monitor and control every aspect of his subjects' lives. The Chancery, which had previously been a relatively small office responsible for drafting royal letters, grew into a massive secretariat that produced thousands of documents each year. The pipe rolls, or annual financial accounts, that survive from John's reign provide extraordinary insight into the operation of this administrative machine. These massive documents, some containing hundreds of parchment membranes, recorded every payment to and from the royal treasury with meticulous detail. They reveal a government obsessed with financial control and determined to extract maximum revenue from every available source. John's personal involvement in this administrative work was unprecedented for a medieval king. While his predecessors had generally delegated financial matters to subordinates, John personally reviewed accounts, questioned expenditures, and demanded explanations for discrepancies. His surviving letters contained detailed instructions about the collection of specific debts, the management of particular estates, and the punishment of individual tax evaders. This hands-on approach to government reflected both John's exceptional education in administrative matters and his desperate need to maximize revenues. Unlike Richard I, who had been content to leave England's governance to capable subordinates while he pursued military glory on crusade, John understood that his political survival depended on the efficient exploitation of his kingdom's resources. The military preparations that accompanied John's financial reforms were equally systematic and innovative. Traditional medieval armies, based on feudal obligations that limited service to 40 days per year, were inadequate for the extended campaigns that would be necessary to reconquer the continent. John therefore began recruiting professional soldiers who could serve for as long as their wages were paid. These mercenary forces, drawn from across Europe, but particularly from the Low Countries and Poitou, represented a significant departure from traditional English military organization. Unlike feudal levies, whose loyalty was based on personal relationships and hereditary obligations, mercenaries served purely for money and could be expected to remain loyal only as long as their wages were regularly paid. The use of foreign mercenaries also had important political implications. English nobles who might have balked at serving in extended continental campaigns could not prevent John from hiring foreigners to do the same work. This reduced the king's dependence on his potentially unreliable vassals, while creating a military force that was directly responsive to royal command. John's most trusted military commanders during this period were largely foreigners who owed their positions entirely to royal favor. Men like Fawkes de Broat from Normandy, Gerard de Thie from Touraine, and Engelard de Sigon from Poitou became the backbone of John's military establishment. These men had no independent power base in England, and could therefore be relied upon to support royal policies even when they conflicted with the interests of the English nobility. The construction and improvement of castles throughout England reflected John's understanding that military preparation required more than just raising armies. He invested heavily in upgrading the kingdom's defensive infrastructure, incorporating the latest developments in military architecture and ensuring that key strongholds could withstand extended sieges. The Great Round Tower at Pembroke Castle in Wales, built during John's reign, exemplified the sophistication of his military engineering. This massive structure, with walls over 6 feet thick and a height of nearly 80 feet, was designed to serve as both a residence for royal officials and an impregnable fortress capable of controlling the surrounding countryside. Similar improvements were made to castles throughout England, creating a network of strongholds that would serve as bases for royal armies and refuges in times of crisis. John's diplomatic efforts during this period were as systematic as his military and financial preparations. He understood that any successful campaign to reconquer his continental territories would require allies who could threaten Philip Augustus from multiple directions. This led him to pursue alliances with rulers throughout Europe, offering subsidies, marriage alliances, and territorial concessions in exchange for military support. The most important of these alliances was with Otto IV of Brunswick, John's nephew and a claimant to the Holy Roman Empire. Otto's position as emperor gave him theoretical authority over much of Germany and eastern France, making him a potentially powerful ally against Philip Augustus. However, Otto's actual control over imperial territories was limited, and his conflict with papal-supported rivals made his position precarious. John's support for Otto brought him into conflict with Pope Innocent III, who favored Otto's rival, Frederick II of Sicily. This papal opposition would have serious consequences for John's domestic position, as it provided legal justification for ecclesiastical resistance to royal policies. However, John calculated that the potential military benefits of the alliance outweighed the risks of papal displeasure. The alliance with Flanders was equally important for John's strategic planning. The Flemish counts controlled territories that bordered France directly and commanded substantial military resources based on the wealth of their textile industry. By providing subsidies to Count Ferdinand of Flanders, John hoped to create a second front that would force Philip Augustus to divide his armies and attention. These diplomatic efforts required enormous financial outlays that further strained John's already overstretched resources. The subsidies paid to continental allies often exceeded the revenues generated by entire English counties, forcing John to intensify his domestic taxation policies and creating additional resentment among his English subjects. John's relationship with Wales and Scotland during this period reflected his understanding that security at home was essential for any successful continental campaign. The Welsh princes, traditionally resistant to English authority, saw John's weakness as an opportunity to expand their own territories and influence. Similarly, the Scottish kings viewed the reduction of Angevin power as a chance to settle old scores and perhaps recover territories lost to previous English kings. John's campaigns in Wales were characterized by the same systematic approach that marked all his military efforts. Rather than attempting to conquer Welsh territories directly, he sought to control the Welsh princes through a combination of diplomatic pressure, financial incentives, and strategic intermarriage. His arrangement of a marriage between his illegitimate daughter, Joan, and Llywelyn, the Great of Gwynedd, was typical of this policy, creating family ties that were designed to ensure Welsh cooperation. However, John's treatment of Welsh hostages and his demands for tribute often provoked the very rebellions he sought to prevent. The Welsh princes, with their strong traditions of independence and their intimate knowledge of difficult terrain, proved to be formidable opponents when pushed too far. John's military successes in Wales were often temporary, requiring repeated campaigns that drained resources needed for continental purposes. The Scottish situation was complicated by the complex feudal relationship between the English and Scottish crowns. The Scottish kings owed homage to the English crown for certain territories, but they also maintained their independence in other matters. John's attempts to clarify and strengthen these relationships often backfired, creating resentments that would influence Scottish policy for generations. The Treaty of Norham, signed with King William the Lion of Scotland in 1209, exemplified John's approach to these northern relationships. William was forced to pay a substantial tribute, surrender his daughters as hostages, and acknowledge John's overlordship in more explicit terms than previous agreements had required. While this treaty temporarily secured John's northern frontier, it also created lasting Scottish resentment of English pretensions to superiority. As John pursued these various strategies for rebuilding his power, he also faced a growing crisis in his relationship with the Church that would ultimately overshadow all his other problems. The death of Hubert Walter, Archbishop of Canterbury, in July 1205 created a vacancy that would trigger one of the most serious conflicts between secular and ecclesiastical authority in medieval history. Hubert Walter had been far more than simply the head of the English Church. He had served as John's justiciar, or chief administrator, and had been instrumental in managing the kingdom during Richard I's absences on crusade. His death deprived John of his most capable advisor and created an opportunity for forces within the Church to challenge royal authority over ecclesiastical appointments. The dispute over Walter's successor revealed fundamental disagreements about the nature of royal authority and the independence of the Church. John, following the precedent established by his predecessors, expected to have a decisive voice in choosing the new archbishop. His preferred candidate was John de Grey, Bishop of Norwich, a loyal royal servant who could be expected to subordinate ecclesiastical interests to royal policy when necessary. However, the monks of Canterbury Cathedral, who traditionally participated in the selection of their archbishop, had their own ideas about the succession. In a secret meeting held shortly after Walter's death, they elected their own candidate, Reginald, the sub-prior of their monastery. This election was conducted without royal consultation and represented a direct challenge to the king's traditional authority over major ecclesiastical appointments. The Canterbury monks' decision to elect Reginald in secret and send him to Rome for papal confirmation was a calculated gamble that reflected their understanding of the changing political situation. With John weakened by his continental losses and facing opposition from many quarters, they may have calculated that papal support would be sufficient to override royal objections. Pope Innocent III's response to the competing claims for the Canterbury archbishopric demonstrated both his political skill and his determination to assert papal authority over the universal Church. Rather than simply confirming one of the existing candidates, Innocent rejected both Reginald and John de Grey and imposed his own choice. Stephen Langton, an English scholar who had spent most of his career teaching theology at the University of Paris, Langton was an inspired choice from Innocent's perspective. As an Englishman, he could not be dismissed as a foreign interloper, yet his long residence in Paris meant that he had no established connections to either royal or monarchical factions within England. His reputation as a scholar and theologian gave him intellectual credentials that would be difficult to challenge, while his experience at Paris had exposed him to the latest developments in canon law and ecclesiastical administration. From John's perspective, however, Langton's appointment was an intolerable insult to royal authority. The new archbishop had been selected without any consultation with the king, and had spent years in the capital of John's greatest enemy. His scholarly reputation meant little to a king who valued loyalty and administrative competence above intellectual distinction. John's initial response to Langton's appointment was characteristically direct. He refused to allow the new archbishop to enter England and seized the revenues of the Canterbury estates. This confrontation escalated rapidly, as both sides proved unwilling to compromise on what they saw as fundamental principles. Innocent III's decision to place England under an interdict in March 1208 was one of the most dramatic assertions of papal authority in medieval history. An interdict was essentially a strike by the church. All religious services were suspended. Church bells fell silent, and the sacraments were denied to the entire population, except in cases of life-threatening emergency. The impact of the interdict on daily life in medieval England can hardly be overstated. In a deeply religious society where the rhythms of life were structured around church services and holy days, the sudden silence of the bells and the closing of church doors created a profound sense of dislocation. Marriages could not be celebrated with religious ceremonies, the dead could not be buried in consecrated ground, and the weekly cycle of religious observance that had provided structure and meaning to countless lives was suddenly disrupted. Contemporary chroniclers noted the eerie silence that descended upon the English countryside as church bells, which had previously marked the hours of the day and called communities to prayer, fell silent. The visual impact was equally striking, as churches that had been centers of community life stood empty and locked, their doors barred to the faithful who had worshipped there for generations. John's response to the interdict revealed both his political calculation and his genuine indifference to popular religious sentiment. Rather than yielding to papal pressure, he saw the church's withdrawal from active participation in English life as an opportunity to seize ecclesiastical revenues and demonstrate his independence from Roman authority. The king's agents moved swiftly to occupy church lands and appropriate ecclesiastical revenues throughout England. Bishops who supported the interdict were forced into exile, while those who remained were required to pay heavy fines for the privilege of staying in their dioceses. Monastic communities found their properties confiscated and their members dispersed or forced to accept royal control over their affairs. John's treatment of the church during the interdict extended beyond simple financial exploitation to include systematic harassment designed to break ecclesiastical resistance. Clergy who refused to perform religious services were imprisoned or expelled, while their replacements were carefully selected for their willingness to cooperate with royal policies regardless of papal directives. The seizure of church property during the interdict provided John with additional revenues that helped fund his military preparations. But it also created new enemies and demonstrated to potential allies that the English king was willing to violate the most sacred principles of medieval society. The spectacle of a Christian king systematically plundering the church alienated potential supporters throughout Europe and provided his enemies with powerful propaganda weapons. Innocent III's decision to excommunicate John personally in November 1209 escalated the conflict to a new level of severity. Excommunication was the church's ultimate weapon against secular rulers, cutting them off from the Christian community and theoretically releasing their subjects from their oaths of loyalty. In practice, the effectiveness of excommunication depended largely on the political circumstances of individual cases, but it always carried serious implications for a ruler's legitimacy and national standing. The formal process of excommunication was conducted with elaborate ceremonial designed to emphasize the gravity of the sentence. The excommunicated person was declared to be outside the Christian community, cut off from the sacraments, and damned to eternal punishment unless he repented and received absolution. In John's case, the excommunication was accompanied by a formal declaration that anyone who continued to serve the excommunicated king would themselves be subject to ecclesiastical penalties. John's reaction to his excommunication was typically defiant. He intensified his persecution of the English clergy, ordering the confiscation of additional church properties and the imprisonment of bishops who refused to cooperate with royal policies. He also sought to demonstrate that excommunication had not weakened his position by launching new military campaigns in Ireland and Wales. The Irish expedition of 1210 was the largest military operation mounted by an English king in Ireland since the original conquest under Henry II. John landed at Waterford with a substantial army that included many of his most experienced mercenary commanders and proceeded to systematically assert royal authority over the Anglo-Norman lords who had established themselves in Ireland. Following the initial conquest, the Irish campaign served multiple purposes for John. It demonstrated his military capability to potential critics who might have questioned his effectiveness after the loss of Normandy. It also provided opportunities for his commanders to gain combat experience and for the king himself to test new military techniques and equipment that might prove useful in future continental campaigns. More importantly, the Irish expedition allowed John to reward his most loyal supporters with grants of land and position in Ireland, while simultaneously removing potential sources of opposition from England. The Anglo-Norman lords of Ireland, who had enjoyed considerable independence during Richard's reign, found themselves subject to much more direct royal control as John established new administrative structures and appointed his own men to key positions. John's treatment of the prominent Anglo-Norman family of de Braos during this period exemplified both his paranoid suspicions and his willingness to destroy even his former supporters if he perceived them as threats. William de Braos had been one of John's most trusted commanders during the early years of his reign, but his knowledge of Arthur, of Brittany's fate, and his growing wealth and independence made him a target of royal suspicion. The destruction of the de Braos family was accomplished through a combination of financial pressure and physical violence that shocked even John's contemporaries. When William de Braos refused to pay the enormous sum of 40,000 marks that John demanded as a relief for his lands, the king ordered the imprisonment of William's wife Maud and their son William the Younger. The fate of Maud de Braos and her son became one of the most notorious examples of John's cruelty. Imprisoned in Corfe Castle in Dorset, they were reportedly denied food and left to starve to death. According to contemporary accounts, when their bodies were discovered, Maud was found to have gnawed on her son's face in her final, desperate hunger. This atrocity went far beyond the normal bounds of medieval political conflict and created the wave of revulsion that extended throughout the European nobility. The deliberate starvation of a noblewoman and her child violated every principle of chivalric conduct and demonstrated that John was capable of actions that placed him outside the community of civilized rulers. The de Braos affair also had serious political consequences for John's position in Wales and Ireland, where William had extensive holdings and connections. The brutal elimination of such a prominent family created fear among other nobles about their own security and convinced many that John could not be trusted to respect traditional rights and customs. John's Welsh campaigns during this period were characterized by the same systematic ruthlessness that marked his other military operations. The 1211 expedition into Gwynedd was designed to break the power of Llywelyn the Great, who had emerged as the most formidable of the Welsh princes. The campaign was initially successful, forcing Llywelyn to submit and surrender hostages, but it also demonstrated the limitations of English military power in the difficult terrain of Wales. The temporary nature of John's Welsh successes reflected the fundamental problem of controlling territories whose inhabitants were determined to resist foreign rule. Unlike his continental losses, which could be attributed to military defeat and political betrayal, John's difficulties in Wales and Ireland stemmed from the impossibility of establishing permanent control over populations that retained their own cultural identity and political traditions. The broader European political situation during John's period of excommunication was increasingly unfavorable to English interests. Philip Augustus had used his military successes against John to establish France as the dominant power in Western Europe, while the papal imperial conflict in Germany created instability that limited the effectiveness of John's potential allies. John's support for Otto IV in the imperial conflict brought him additional papal hostility while providing limited military benefit. Otto's position was precarious, and his frequent defeats at the hands of papal supported rivals meant that he was often unable to provide the assistance that John's subsidies were meant to purchase. The development of the Albigensian Crusade in southern France created additional complications for John's diplomatic position. This papal-sponsored campaign against heretics in Languedoc provided Philip Augustus with opportunities to extend French influence into regions that had previously been outside his control, while also demonstrating the Church's ability to mobilize military resources against its enemies. By 1212, John's position had become increasingly precarious. The Interdict had lasted for more than 4 years, creating widespread discontent among his subjects and isolating England from the broader European community. His harsh taxation policies had generated enormous resentment among the English nobility, while his treatment of prominent families like the de Brausers had convinced many that he posed a direct threat to their security. The discovery of a plot to assassinate John in 1212 demonstrated that opposition to his rule had moved beyond passive resistance to active conspiracy. The plot, which involved several prominent northern barons, was apparently triggered by a prophecy that John would not survive past Ascension, day 1213. While the conspiracy was discovered and its leaders fled before they could act, its existence revealed the depth of hostility that John's policies had created. John's response to the assassination plot was characteristically harsh. He ordered the confiscation of the conspirators' lands and the imprisonment of their families and supporters. However, he also recognized that the plot was a symptom of broader problems that could not be solved through force alone. The decision to seek reconciliation with the papacy in 1213 reflected John's growing understanding that his isolation was becoming politically unsustainable. The threat of French invasion, supported by papal authority, combined with domestic unrest to create a situation that required fundamental changes in royal policy. The negotiations that led to John's submission to papal authority were conducted with characteristic secrecy and complexity. John's representatives met with papal legates to work out the terms of a settlement that would restore England to the Christian community while preserving as much royal authority as possible. The final agreement, reached in May 1213, required John to accept Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury and to compensate the Church for the revenues seized during the Interdict. More dramatically, John agreed to surrender the kingdoms of England and Ireland to the papacy and receive them back as papal fiefs, making him technically a vassal of the Pope. This dramatic submission was designed to transform John's greatest weakness into a source of strength. By making himself the Pope's vassal, John gained Innocent III as a powerful protector who would have both the authority and the motivation to defend English interests against foreign attack. The ceremony of submission at Dover on May 15, 1213, was carefully staged to emphasize both John's humility before papal authority and his new status as a papal protege. In the presence of Pandolf, the papal legate, John formally surrendered his crown and received it back as a grant from the Pope, symbolically acknowledging papal supremacy while practically securing papal support. The immediate benefits of John's submission were substantial. The Interdict was lifted, allowing normal religious life to resume throughout England. The threat of French invasion, which had been supported by papal authority, was removed as Innocent III switched from opposing John to protecting him. Perhaps most importantly, John had gained time to continue his military and financial preparations for the Continental campaign that remained his primary objective. However, the submission to papal authority also had costs that would become apparent. In the following years, John's agreement to accept Stephen Langton as Archbishop brought a formidable opponent into the heart of English government. Langton's combination of scholarly authority, ecclesiastical position, and political skill would make him one of the most effective critics of royal policy during the final years of John's reign. The financial obligations that John accepted as part of his reconciliation with the Church also added to his already crushing fiscal burdens. The compensation required for the Church's losses during the Interdict amounted to thousands of marks that would have to be extracted from his subjects through additional taxation. Most seriously, John's submission to papal authority had demonstrated to his subjects and his enemies that even the King of England could be forced to yield when sufficient pressure was applied. This lesson would not be lost on the English barons, who were growing increasingly resentful of royal policies and increasingly confident in their ability to challenge royal authority. As 1213 drew to a close, John had apparently solved his most pressing problems. The Interdict was lifted, the threat of invasion had been removed, and he had gained papal support for his continental ambitions. Yet the very methods he had used to achieve these successes had created new problems that would ultimately prove even more dangerous than those he had solved. The stage was now set for John's final attempt to recover his continental empire, a campaign that would end in decisive defeat and trigger the domestic crisis that led to Magna Carta. The king, who had spent nearly a decade preparing for this moment, was about to discover that military success required more than careful planning and adequate resources. It also required the loyalty and confidence of his subjects, qualities that John's harsh rule had systematically undermined. The year 1214 dawned with King John, more confident than he had been at any point since the catastrophic loss of Normandy a decade earlier. His reconciliation with Pope Innocent III had restored England to the Christian community and eliminated the threat of papal-sponsored invasion. His treasury, swollen by years of innovative taxation and ecclesiastical plunder, contained wealth sufficient to fund the most ambitious military campaign of his reign. Most encouragingly, his patient diplomatic efforts had finally borne fruit in the form of a grand alliance that seemed capable of crushing Philip Augustus and restoring Angevin greatness. The coalition that John had assembled represented the culmination of nearly 10 years of careful negotiation and enormous financial investment. At its heart was the alliance with his nephew Otto IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, whose theoretical authority over Germany and eastern France made him a formidable potential threat to Philip Augustus. Count Ferdinand of Flanders, whose territories bordered France directly and whose wealth from the Flemish textile trade had purchased the finest mercenary soldiers available, formed another crucial element of the coalition. Perhaps most importantly, Count Renaud of Boulogne had agreed to join the alliance, bringing with him control of territories that commanded the narrow sea crossing between England and the continent. Renaud's support would be essential for maintaining communications and supply lines between England and the continental theatre of operations. The strategic concept underlying John's Grand Alliance was elegantly simple. Philip Augustus would be caught between two converging armies and crushed by superior force. John would land in Poitou with a substantial army drawn from England and his remaining continental territories, then advance northward toward the heart of France. Simultaneously, Otto, Ferdinand, and Renaud would march south from their territories in Germany and the Low Countries, creating a pincer movement that would force Philip to divide his forces and fight on two fronts simultaneously. The financial cost of this coalition was staggering, even by the standards of John's expensive reign. The subsidies paid to his continental allies exceeded the entire annual revenue of most European kingdoms. Otto alone received more than 75,000 marks, while Ferdinand and Renaud shared additional tens of thousands of marks. These enormous payments represented the accumulated wealth that John had extracted from his subjects over nearly a decade of harsh taxation. John's personal contribution to the campaign would be equally substantial. The army he planned to lead to Poitou was the largest English force to cross the Channel since the Norman conquest, numbering perhaps 15,000 men, including knights, sergeants, crossbowmen, and infantry. The logistical challenges of transporting, supplying, and coordinating such a force across hundreds of miles of potentially hostile territory would test every aspect of John's administrative and military capabilities. The departure of the English expedition from Portsmouth in February 1214 was staged as a magnificent display of royal power and determination. John had spared no expense in equipping his army with the finest weapons and armor available, while his personal retinue included some of the most experienced military commanders in Europe. The sight of hundreds of ships carrying thousands of soldiers across the Channel must have seemed like the dawn of a new age of Angevin triumph. John's landing at La Rochelle was accomplished without opposition, as Philip Augustus had apparently decided to concentrate his forces against the northern threat posed by Otto and the Flemish coalition, rather than attempting to prevent John's invasion. This strategic decision would prove to be militarily sound but politically costly, as it allowed John to establish himself in Poitou and begin the systematic recovery of territories that had been lost in 1204. The initial phase of John's campaign exceeded his most optimistic expectations. The Poitevin nobility, many of whom had submitted to French rule reluctantly after the collapse of Angevin power, welcomed John's return with apparent enthusiasm. Castle after castle opened its gates to the English army, while French garrisons withdrew or surrendered without serious resistance. John's advance through Poitou was methodical and systematic, reflecting the careful planning that had characterized his entire approach to the continental recovery. Rather than rushing toward dramatic confrontations that might risk his entire force, he concentrated on securing his lines of communication and establishing firm control over the territories he occupied. This cautious approach disappointed some of his more aggressive commanders, but it reflected John's understanding that premature action could jeopardize the entire campaign. The psychological impact of John's return was perhaps even more important than his military successes. For nearly 10 years, the former subjects of the Angevin Empire had lived under French rule, many of them wondering whether English power would ever return to challenge Philip Augustus's dominance. John's presence in Poitou, at the head of a powerful army, demonstrated that the Angevin cause was far from dead, and encouraged nobles throughout the region to reconsider their loyalties. By summer 1214, John controlled most of Poitou and was advancing steadily toward the Loire Valley, the traditional boundary between the Angevin heartland of Anjou and the French royal domain. His progress was facilitated by the defection of several important French commanders, including Robert of Dreux, Philip Augustus's own cousin, who brought valuable intelligence about French military dispositions and strategic planning. The capture of Angers, the ancient capital of the Angevin dynasty, would have represented the symbolic culmination of John's campaign and the practical restoration of the empire that his father, Henry II, had built. The city's massive walls and strategic position on the Loire made it one of the most important fortresses in France, while its historic significance as the seat of Angevin power gave it an emotional importance that transcended its military value. John's siege of Rochemont, the fortress that guarded the approaches to Angers, brought him closer to complete success than he had been since the early days of his reign. The castle's fall would open the road to Angers and potentially trigger a general collapse of French resistance in the Loire Valley. However, it was at this crucial moment that John's campaign began to unravel due to circumstances largely beyond his control. Prince Louis of France, Philip Augustus's eldest son and heir, had been dispatched with a relief army to break John's siege and prevent the loss of the Loire Valley. Louis's force was smaller than John's army, but it included many of France's most experienced knights and was supported by local nobles, who had remained loyal to the Capetian cause. The confrontation at Rochemont on July 2, 1214, would prove to be one of the most significant non-battles in medieval history. When John learned of Louis's approach, he prepared for the pitched battle that would determine the fate of his entire campaign. His army was deployed in strong defensive positions. His commanders were confident, and victory seemed within reach. However, at the crucial moment when the two armies faced each other across the battlefield, a significant portion of John's Poitevin allies refused to advance against Louis's forces. These local nobles, who had welcomed John's return and supported his campaign throughout Poitou, apparently balked at the prospect of fighting French princes in a battle that would determine the future of the region. The reasons for this sudden failure of nerve remain debated by historians, but they probably reflected the complex loyalties and calculations that governed noble behavior in medieval France. Many of the Poitevin nobles had family connections and financial interests that transcended the immediate political situation. Fighting alongside John against inferior French forces was one thing. Engaging in a decisive battle against the heir to the French throne was quite another. John's response to this crisis revealed both his military limitations and his fundamental misunderstanding of the political dynamics in his continental territories. Rather than attempting to rally his wavering allies or seeking alternative strategies that might salvage the situation, he ordered a general retreat that abandoned the siege of Rochemont and effectively conceded the campaign to French forces. This retreat was particularly damaging because it occurred at the moment when John appeared to be on the verge of complete victory. The psychological impact of the withdrawal was devastating for Angevin supporters throughout the region, many of whom had risked their lives and fortunes on the assumption that John possessed the determination and capability to see his campaign through to a successful conclusion. The abandonment of the siege also wasted the enormous financial and military resources that John had invested in the campaign. The army that had cost so much to transport, equip, and maintain was withdrawn without achieving any of its primary objectives, while the political capital that had been built up through early successes was squandered in a single day of apparent cowardice. While John retreated southward to consolidate his position in the remaining Angevin territories, the fate of his Grand Alliance was being decided hundreds of miles to the north in the fields around the village of Bouvines. The battle that took place there on July 27, 1214, would prove to be one of the most consequential military engagements of the entire medieval period, with implications that extended far beyond the immediate question of Angevin recovery. The armies that faced each other at Bouvines represented the culmination of the two great alliance systems that had been developing across Europe for more than a decade. On one side stood Philip Augustus, with the full military might of the French kingdom, reinforced by allies who had remained loyal to the Capetian cause throughout the period of Angevin resurgence. Opposing them was the coalition that John had assembled at such enormous cost. Otto IV with his imperial forces, Ferdinand of Flanders with his mercenary companies, and Renaud of Boulogne with his experienced knights. The battle itself was a brutal affair that lasted most of the day and involved tens of thousands of combatants. Unlike many medieval engagements, which were decided quickly by cavalry charges or the collapse of one side's morale, Bouvines was characterized by sustained fighting that tested the endurance and determination of both armies. The course of the battle initially favored the coalition forces, as their superior numbers and aggressive tactics pushed back French resistance at several points. Otto's imperial knights, in particular, fought with desperate courage, understanding that defeat would end their emperor's political ambitions and potentially cost them their lives. For several hours, it appeared that John's grand strategy might succeed and that Philip Augustus would suffer the decisive defeat that would restore Angevin power. However, the tide of battle gradually turned in favor of the French forces as their superior organization and the inspirational leadership of Philip Augustus himself began to tell. The King of France, despite being in his late 40s and not known as a warrior, fought personally in the front ranks of his army and inspired his followers through his example of courage and determination. The decisive moment came when Philip Augustus's cavalry managed to isolate and overwhelm Otto IV's personal standard, capturing the imperial eagle and forcing the emperor to flee the battlefield. This dramatic success created panic in the coalition ranks and triggered a general collapse that left Ferdinand of Flanders and hundreds of other prominent nobles as prisoners of the French crown. The magnitude of the French victory at Bouvines exceeded even Philip Augustus's most optimistic expectations. The battle had not merely repelled an invasion, but had effectively destroyed the coalition that had threatened French security for years. Otto IV's imperial pretensions were ended. Ferdinand of Flanders was removed from the political equation, and Renaud of Boulogne was captured, along with most of his followers. For John, the news of the disaster at Bouvines arrived like a thunderbolt that shattered all his hopes and dreams of continental recovery. The coalition that had cost him more than 200,000 marks to assemble had been destroyed in a single afternoon, while his most important allies were either dead, captured, or fleeing for their lives. The grand strategy that was supposed to restore Angevin greatness had instead confirmed French dominance over Western Europe. The immediate aftermath of Bouvines forced John to abandon any remaining hopes of continuing his continental campaign. Without his northern allies to maintain pressure on Philip Augustus, John's position in Poitou became untenable. French forces, freed from the need to defend against coalition attacks, could now concentrate overwhelming force against John's remaining territories. John's withdrawal from the continent in October 1214 marked the end of the last serious attempt to restore the Angevin Empire. The king, who had devoted nearly 15 years and unprecedented resources to the goal of continental recovery, returned to England empty-handed, his treasury exhausted and his reputation in ruins. The financial cost of the failed campaign was staggering even by the standards of John's expensive reign. In addition to the enormous subsidies paid to his continental allies, John had spent vast sums on transporting, equipping, and maintaining his army throughout the campaign. The total expenditure may have exceeded 300,000 marks, a sum that represented several years' worth of normal royal revenue. This financial disaster came at a time when John's subjects were already strained to the breaking point by years of unprecedented taxation. The innovative levies that had funded John's military preparations had generated enormous resentment among the English nobility, while the common people had suffered under the burden of supporting military campaigns that seemed to produce nothing but defeat and humiliation. More seriously, the failure of the Bouvines campaign had demonstrated the futility of John's entire approach to governance. For 15 years, he had justified his harsh policies and extraordinary demands by claiming that they were necessary for the recovery of the continental empire. Now that this goal had been proven unattainable, his subjects naturally questioned whether such sacrifices had ever been justified. The political implications of John's failure extended far beyond questions of taxation and military policy. The barons who had supported his continental ambitions, often at considerable personal cost, now felt betrayed by a king who had promised much and delivered nothing. The common people, who had borne the burden of supporting these expensive campaigns, saw no reason to continue accepting hardships for the sake of a cause that had been decisively lost. John's return to England in October 1214 was therefore the beginning of the final crisis of his reign, rather than simply another temporary setback. The king who had once commanded respect through his administrative competence and continental connections now appeared as a failed ruler, whose policies had brought nothing but expense and humiliation. The baronial opposition that had been developing throughout John's reign now began to coalesce into organized resistance. The northern barons, who had been among the most vocal critics of John's policies, took the lead in articulating demands for fundamental changes in the relationship between the crown and its subjects. These northern barons represented a distinctive regional interest that had been largely ignored during the Angevin period. Unlike their counterparts in southern England, who had benefited from the cross-channel connections that characterized Angevin rule, the northern nobles had little stake in continental adventures and considerable resentment about the taxes required to fund them. The emergence of Robert Fitzwalter as a leader of the baronial opposition gave the movement both focus and legitimacy. Fitzwalter was one of the most prominent barons in England, with extensive estates and connections throughout the nobility. His personal grievances against John, which reportedly included the king's unwelcome advances toward his daughter, provided him with both motivation and credibility in opposing royal policies. The baronial opposition's decision to invoke the Charter of Liberties issued by Henry I at his coronation in 1100 demonstrated their understanding that their grievances were part of a larger constitutional question about the limits of royal authority. Henry I's charter had promised to respect the traditional rights and customs of his subjects, and the barons now demanded that John make similar commitments. However, the barons' demands went far beyond the relatively modest concessions contained in Henry I's charter. The intervening century had seen the development of much more sophisticated ideas about the relationship between rulers and subjects, influenced by the growth of canon law, the revival of Roman legal concepts, and practical experience with the limitations of royal authority. Stephen Langton's role in developing the baronial program cannot be overstated. As Archbishop of Canterbury, he possessed both the intellectual authority and the institutional position necessary to give scholarly respectability to what might otherwise have been dismissed as mere baronial self-interest. His background as a theology professor at the University of Paris had exposed him to the latest developments in political theory and constitutional thinking. Langton's contribution to the emerging constitutional crisis went beyond simple political opposition to include sophisticated legal analysis of the proper relationship between crown and subjects. His understanding of both canon law and emerging concepts of natural law provided the intellectual framework for challenging royal policies that had previously been accepted as matters of royal discretion. The secret meeting of barons at Bury, St. Edmunds, in November 1214, marked the transformation of scattered opposition into organized rebellion. The choice of location was significant, as the Abbey of Bury St. Edmunds was associated with English independence and resistance to foreign domination. The barons who gathered there swore an oath to compel John to respect their traditional rights, or face the consequences of their united opposition. John's initial response to the emerging baronial movement demonstrated his continued failure to understand the seriousness of the political situation he faced. Rather than attempting to address the barons' concerns through negotiation and compromise, he sought to intimidate them through displays of royal power and threats of punishment for those who opposed royal authority. The king's decision to take crusading vows in March 1215 was a transparent attempt to place himself under papal protection and make it more difficult for his opponents to act against him. As a crusader, John could claim the special protection of the church and portray any opposition to his rule as an attack on a servant of Christ engaged in holy war. However, this maneuver backfired when the barons called John's bluff by formally renouncing their feudal obligations to him in May 1215. This act of defiance, which they justified on the grounds that John had violated his own obligations as their lord, represented the complete breakdown of the feudal relationship that was supposed to govern the interaction between king and nobles, the barons. Capture of London in May 1215 transformed the constitutional crisis into open civil war. The capital's defection to the baronial cause was a devastating blow to John's position, as it deprived him of the political and financial center of his kingdom while providing his opponents with a powerful symbol of their success. London's support for the baronial cause reflected the broader resentment that John's policies had created among the merchant and artisan classes. The city's wealth depended on trade and commerce, both of which had suffered under the burden of John's taxation and the instability created by his continental adventures. The Londoners' decision to open their gates to the rebels demonstrated that opposition to John extended far beyond the nobility to include important elements of the urban population. The negotiations that led to the meeting at Runnymede were conducted against the backdrop of military stalemate and mutual recognition that neither side could achieve a complete victory. John, despite retaining control of important strongholds and the loyalty of significant portions of the nobility, lacked the resources to dislodge the rebels from London or prevent them from gaining additional support. The barons, for their part, were unable to capture John or force him into unconditional surrender. The choice of Runnymede as the location for the final negotiations reflected the need for a neutral site that would be acceptable to both parties. This meadow on the Thames between Windsor Castle and the town of Staines had the advantage of being easily accessible to representatives of both sides, while offering sufficient space for the large entourages that would accompany the principal negotiators. Stephen Langton's role as mediator in the Runnymede negotiations was crucial to achieving any agreement at all. His position as Archbishop of Canterbury gave him the moral authority necessary to broker a deal between such bitter enemies, while his intellectual background enabled him to draft language that addressed the complex legal and political issues at stake. The document that emerged from these negotiations, initially known as the Articles of the Barons and later as Magna Carta, represented a remarkable achievement in medieval political thought. Unlike previous royal charters, which had typically been granted voluntarily by kings seeking to curry favor with their subjects, Magna Carta was extracted from John through a combination of military pressure and political necessity. The 63 clauses of Magna Carta covered an enormous range of issues, from technical questions about feudal obligations to fundamental principles about the relationship between ruler and ruled. While many of the specific provisions were of immediate concern only to the baronial class, others established principles that would influence constitutional development for centuries to come. Clause 39, which promised that no free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions or outlawed or exiled or deprived of his standing in any other way. Nor will we proceed with force against him or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals, or by the law of the land. established the principle that even kings were subject to legal limitations and could not act arbitrarily against their subjects. Clause 40's promise that to no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice complemented this principle by establishing the king's obligation to provide fair and timely legal proceedings for all his subjects. Together, these clauses laid the foundation for concepts of due process and the rule of law that would become central to English constitutional tradition. The taxation clauses of Magna Carta addressed one of the most immediate sources of baronial grievance by requiring royal consultation before the imposition of extraordinary levies. Clause 12 specified that no scutage nor aid shall be imposed on our kingdom, unless by common council of our kingdom, while subsequent clauses detailed the procedures for obtaining such consent. These provisions represented a fundamental limitation on royal financial authority and established the principle that taxation required consent from those who would be required to pay, while the immediate application of these principles was limited to the feudal class. They would eventually evolve into the broader concept of parliamentary consent to taxation that became central to English political development. The forest clauses of Magna Carta addressed another major source of popular grievance by promising to reform the harsh forest laws that had been used to extract enormous revenues from rural communities. These provisions reflected the widespread resentment created by John's systematic exploitation of forest law and his extension of forest jurisdiction to areas that had previously been exempt. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of Magna Carta was Clause 61, which established a committee of 25 barons with the authority to monitor John's compliance with the Charter's provisions and to take action against him if he violated his commitments. This security clause represented an unprecedented limitation on royal authority and established the principle that kings could be held accountable for their actions by their subjects. The ceremony at Runnymede on June 15, 1215, was carefully staged to emphasize both the solemnity of the occasion and the voluntary nature of John's commitment to the Charter's provisions. The king did not sign the document, as signatures were not used for formal legal instruments in the medieval period, but instead attached his royal seal to indicate his acceptance of its terms. The sealing of Magna Carta was followed by the formal renewal of homage by the baronial leaders, symbolically restoring the feudal relationship that had been ruptured by their earlier renunciation of allegiance. This ceremony was designed to demonstrate that the constitutional crisis had been resolved and that normal political relationships could now resume. However, neither John nor his baronial opponents had any real intention of abiding by the terms of the Runnymede Agreement. The king viewed the Charter as an unacceptable limitation on his royal authority that had been extracted from him through force and intimidation. The barons, for their part, remained suspicious of John's trustworthiness and doubtful about his willingness to implement the reforms they had demanded. John's appeal to Pope Innocent III for support in overturning Magna Carta was made almost immediately after the Runnymede ceremony. The king argued that the Charter had been imposed upon him through force and represented an unacceptable limitation on the royal authority that he held from God. He also reminded the Pope that England was a papal fief and that any limitations on royal authority required papal consent. Innocent III's response to John's appeal was swift and decisive. In the papal bull Et Si Carissimus, issued in August 1215, the Pope declared Magna Carta null and void of all validity forever and forbade John from observing its provisions. This papal intervention transformed the constitutional crisis into a religious conflict and provided both sides with additional justifications for their positions. The renewal of civil war in the autumn of 1215 was therefore almost inevitable. given the fundamental incompatibility of the positions taken by John and his opponents. The king, supported by papal authority, refused to implement the reforms promised at Runnymede, while the barons, convinced that John could never be trusted to keep his word, prepared for renewed military action, the siege of Rochester Castle. In November 1215 marked the beginning of the final phase of John's reign and demonstrated both his military capabilities and his determination to crush baronial opposition. Rochester was one of the strongest fortresses in England, and its capture by royal forces after a bitter siege showed that John retained considerable military resources, despite his political isolation. The fall of Rochester was followed by John's systematic campaign through the northern counties, where baronial opposition was strongest. This winter campaign of 1215 to 1216 was characterized by exceptional brutality as John sought to punish those who had opposed him, while demonstrating to potential rebels the cost of defying royal authority. The devastation of the northern counties during John's winter campaign created a legacy of hatred and resentment that would influence English politics for generations. Contemporary chroniclers described the systematic destruction of crops, livestock, and buildings as John's forces moved through Yorkshire, Lancashire, and Northumberland like an army of conquest rather than a royal expedition restoring order. The baronial decision to invite Prince Louis of France to claim the English throne represented the ultimate rejection of John's authority and the final breakdown of the feudal relationship between king and subjects. By offering the crown to a foreign prince, the rebels were acknowledging that they viewed John as completely illegitimate and unfit to rule. Louis's acceptance of the baronial invitation and his landing in England in May 1216 created a situation that John's predecessors had always feared: foreign invasion supported by domestic rebellion. The arrival of French forces at Sandwich marked the effective partition of England between competing royal authorities and the beginning of what amounted to a war of succession. The rapid expansion of Louis's control following his landing demonstrated the extent of opposition to John's rule. London welcomed the French prince enthusiastically, while baronial strongholds throughout the southeast opened their gates to his forces. Within weeks of his arrival, Louis controlled more English territory than John himself. John's response to the French invasion was hampered by his limited resources and the unreliability of his remaining supporters. Many nobles who had previously remained loyal to the crown now began to waver, uncertain whether continued support for John was worth the risk of finding themselves on the losing side of a dynastic conflict. The siege of Dover Castle became a crucial test of John's ability to resist French expansion. This mighty fortress, which commanded the narrow sea crossing between England and the continent, was essential for maintaining communications with potential allies and preventing additional French reinforcements from reaching Louis's forces. Hubert de Burgh's heroic defense of Dover demonstrated that John still commanded the loyalty of some exceptionally capable subordinates, despite being vastly outnumbered and cut off from outside support. De Burgh's garrison held out against Louis's siege engines and repeated assaults, buying precious time for John to organize his remaining resources. The military stalemate that developed during the summer of 1216 reflected the fundamental weakness of both sides in the conflict. Louis lacked the resources to complete his conquest of England, while John was unable to mount effective counterattacks against the areas controlled by the French prince and his baronial allies. John's final campaign in the autumn of 1216 was a desperate attempt to break this stalemate by striking at the heart of the rebellion in East Anglia and Lincolnshire. Despite his advancing age and deteriorating health, the king personally led his forces in what he must have known would be his last chance to save his throne and his dynasty. The warm reception that John received at King's Lynn demonstrated that he retained some popular support, particularly in areas that had benefited from his policies or felt threatened by French occupation. The townspeople's enthusiasm for their king's visit suggested that opposition to John, while widespread among the nobility, was not universal among the broader population. However, the contrast between this loyal reception and the military realities facing John was stark. Even in areas where he was welcomed, the king struggled to raise effective forces or secure adequate supplies for his campaign. The rebellion had disrupted normal administrative procedures and made it difficult for royal officials to collect revenues or recruit soldiers. John's illness, which first became apparent during his stay at King's Lynn, may have been caused by the dysentery that commonly afflicted medieval armies due to poor sanitation and contaminated water supplies. However, contemporary chroniclers also reported rumors that the king had been poisoned, reflecting the atmosphere of suspicion and conspiracy that surrounded his final campaign. The loss of John's baggage train in the Wash was both a practical disaster and a powerful symbolic event that seemed to summarize the futility of his entire reign. The royal regalia, crown jewels, and personal treasures that purportedly sank into the treacherous waters of the estuary represented the physical manifestation of Angevin power that John had been unable to protect or preserve. Modern historians debate whether this incident was as catastrophic as contemporary accounts suggest. Some argue that the most valuable items in John's baggage train would have been transported by safer routes, and that the loss may have been exaggerated by chroniclers seeking to emphasize the dramatic nature of the king's final days. However, the psychological impact of the incident was undoubtedly significant for John himself. The loss of the symbols of royal authority at such a crucial moment must have seemed like divine judgment on his reign and confirmation that his cause was hopeless. John's final journey to Newark Castle was accomplished under the most difficult circumstances, as the king was transported on a litter because he was too weak to ride. The choice of Newark as his destination was significant, as this royal stronghold had remained loyal throughout the rebellion and offered security for a dying king, whose enemies controlled much of the surrounding territory. The will that John dictated during his final hours at Newark provides remarkable insight into his state of mind as he faced death and the possible end of his dynasty. Unlike the grandiose documents that many medieval kings used to dispose of their worldly goods, John's will was notably brief and focused on practical concerns about the immediate future rather than elaborate provisions for his soul. The king's primary concern was clearly the welfare of his young sons, Henry and Richard, who would inherit a kingdom torn by civil war and facing foreign invasion. His instructions to his executors to provide support for his children in obtaining and defending their inheritance revealed his understanding that the succession would not be automatic and that determined efforts would be required to preserve Plantagenet rule. John's death on the night of October 18th to 19th, 1216, came at a moment when the outcome of the Civil War remained uncertain. The king's supporters controlled important strongholds throughout England, while his son Henry had a legitimate claim to the throne that many might prefer to the rule of a foreign prince. The decision to crown 9-year-old Henry III immediately after his father's death demonstrated the political sophistication of John's remaining supporters. By moving quickly to establish the new king's authority, they prevented Louis from claiming that the throne was vacant and available for foreign occupation. William Marshall's acceptance of the regency for young Henry III was crucial for the survival of the Plantagenet dynasty. As the most respected knight of his generation and a man whose loyalty to the royal family was beyond question, Marshall provided the legitimacy and leadership necessary to rally opposition to French rule. The reissue of Magna Carta by Henry III's government in November 1217 was a masterstroke of political strategy that transformed the charter from a tool of rebellion into a symbol of legitimate royal authority. By voluntarily granting the concessions that had been extracted from John by force, the new government demonstrated its commitment to constitutional rule while undermining the justification for continued rebellion. The military victories at Lincoln and Sandwich in 1217 that finally ended the Civil War were made possible by the political settlement represented by the reissued Magna Carta. Many nobles who had supported Louis because of their opposition to John's policies now felt free to return to their allegiance to the English crown. The Treaty of Lambeth, which formally ended Louis's invasion and restored peace to England, marked the final vindication of John's desperate efforts to preserve his dynasty. Despite all his failures and mistakes, the throne he had fought so hard to defend passed peacefully to his son and remained in Plantagenet hands for another 2.5 centuries. John's burial at Worcester Cathedral reflected both his personal wishes and the political necessities of the moment. Worcester was chosen partly because of John's devotion to St. Wulfstan, but also because it was safely within the territory controlled by his supporters and could provide appropriate dignity for a royal funeral. The tomb effigy of John that was created some years later presents a remarkable image of kingship that contrasts sharply with the historical reality of his reign. Flanked by the figures of Saints Oswald and Wulfstan, the carved king appears serene and dignified, his feet resting on a lion that symbolizes his mastery over the worldly realm. However, the symbolism of the effigy is more complex than it initially appears. The lion on which John's feet rest is shown biting the king's sword, a detail that medieval viewers would have recognized as representing a world in rebellion against royal authority. Even in death, John was remembered as a king who had struggled unsuccessfully to control the forces that ultimately destroyed his reign. The historical reputation of King John has been shaped by the dramatic contrasts and contradictions of his character and reign. He was undoubtedly one of the most capable administrators ever to occupy the English throne, with an understanding of law, finance, and government that exceeded that of most of his contemporaries. Yet his administrative brilliance was coupled with personal characteristics that made him unsuited for the inspirational leadership that medieval kingship required. John's cruelty and untrustworthiness became legendary even during his lifetime, but they reflected deeper problems with his understanding of the relationship between ruler and ruled. Unlike his brother Richard, who inspired loyalty through personal charisma and military success, John sought to control his subjects through fear and financial pressure, methods that ultimately proved counterproductive. The loss of Normandy and the Continental Empire was perhaps inevitable given the resources that Philip Augustus could deploy against divided and demoralized Angevin forces. However, John's responsibility for creating the conditions that made this loss possible cannot be denied. His murder of Arthur, his harsh treatment of prisoners, and his general disregard for the customs and expectations that governed medieval political relationships all contributed to the collapse of support that doomed his continental ambitions. Yet, John's greatest historical significance lies not in his failures but in the constitutional developments that his failures made possible. Magna Carta, which emerged from the wreckage of his reign, established principles of limited government and the rule of law that would influence political development throughout the English-speaking world and beyond. The irony of John's historical legacy is that this king, who sought to maximize royal authority and eliminate all constraints on his power, ultimately became the instrument through which some of the most important limitations on governmental authority were established. The very extremity of his demands and the harshness of his methods created the political coalition that forced him to accept constitutional restrictions that would never have been imposed on a more moderate ruler. In death, John achieved a kind of immortality that had eluded him in life. Magna Carta ensured that his name would be remembered as long as people valued constitutional government and individual rights. The king, who had been known to his contemporaries as a failed ruler and a tyrant, became, through the unintended consequences of his own actions, one of the most important figures in the development of democratic institutions. As the bells of Worcester Cathedral tolled for the dead king on that October day in 1216, few could have imagined that the reign they were mourning would ultimately be remembered not for its failures, but for its contribution to human freedom. John Lackland, who had lost everything he sought to gain, had unknowingly given the world something far more valuable than any territorial empire: the enduring principle that even kings must bow before the law. The transformation of John's reputation from that of a despised tyrant to an inadvertent champion of constitutional government would take centuries to complete. Medieval chroniclers, writing in the immediate aftermath of his reign, portrayed him almost universally as a cautionary tale about the dangers of royal wickedness and the divine punishment that awaited unjust rulers. Roger of Wendover, whose chronicle provided one of the most influential early accounts of John's reign, painted the king as a monster of cruelty and impiety, whose crimes against God and man inevitably led to his downfall. Matthew Paris, who continued Wendover's work, embellished these accounts with additional stories of John's alleged atheism and moral corruption, creating a literary portrait that would influence popular perceptions for generations. These chroniclers were not dispassionate historians, but partisan observers who had lived through the trauma of civil war and foreign invasion. Their accounts reflected both genuine outrage at John's conduct and a natural tendency to portray the recent past in terms that justified the political settlement that had emerged from the chaos of 1215 to 1217. The monastic chroniclers who provided most of our contemporary accounts had particular reason to view John with hostility. His seizure of church property during the Interdict and his general disregard for ecclesiastical privileges had created lasting resentment within religious communities. The stories of his alleged blasphemy and irreligion, while possibly exaggerated, reflected real conflicts between royal and ecclesiastical authority that had characterized much of his reign. Yet even these hostile accounts acknowledged John's exceptional abilities as an administrator and his deep knowledge of law and government. They recognized that his failures stemmed not from incompetence, but from character flaws that prevented him from using his talents effectively. This recognition would become increasingly important as later generations sought to understand the constitutional significance of his reign. The immediate aftermath of John's death saw a remarkable transformation in English political culture that reflected the lasting impact of the conflicts of his reign. The regency government of William Marshall and the papal legate, Guala Bickery, demonstrated that effective governance was possible without the harsh methods that John had employed. The reissued Magna Carta became a central feature of this new political culture, establishing the principle that royal authority was subject to legal limitations, and that government should operate according to established procedures rather than arbitrary royal will. While many of the Charter's specific provisions would be modified or abandoned over time, its fundamental principles became deeply embedded in English constitutional tradition. The peaceful succession of Henry III and the successful resolution of the Civil War also demonstrated the resilience of English political institutions. Despite years of conflict and foreign invasion, the kingdom's administrative and legal structures had survived largely intact, providing a foundation for the restoration of stable government under the new regime. The long reign of Henry III, which would last until 1272, provided time for the constitutional innovations of 1215-17 to become established practice rather than temporary expedients. The young king's minority meant that government was conducted by councils of nobles and clergy who were naturally inclined to maintain the limitations on royal authority that had been established in response to John's excesses. As Henry III reached maturity and began to assert his personal authority, he would find himself constrained by constitutional traditions that had not existed at the beginning of his father's reign. The principle that taxation required consent, the requirement that legal proceedings follow established procedures, and the general expectation that kings should govern according to law rather than personal whim had all become part of the fabric of English political life. The broader European context of the early 13th century also helped to ensure that the constitutional developments associated with John's reign would have lasting significance. The growth of universities, the revival of interest in Roman law, and the increasing sophistication of canon law all contributed to an intellectual environment in which questions about the proper limits of governmental authority were actively debated. The influence of these broader intellectual currents can be seen in the language and concepts employed in Magna Carta itself. The Charter's emphasis on due process, its recognition of individual rights, and its articulation of the principle that government should serve the common good all reflected contemporary developments in legal and political theory. The survival of multiple original copies of Magna Carta ensured that its text would be preserved and studied by future generations. Unlike many medieval documents, which existed only in single copies that could be lost or destroyed, the Charter was distributed widely throughout England, with copies being deposited in cathedral archives and royal administrative centres. This wide distribution also meant that knowledge of the Charter's provisions spread throughout English society, creating a popular awareness of constitutional principles that would prove difficult for later kings to ignore. The Charter became a powerful symbol of English liberties that could be invoked by opponents of royal tyranny in later centuries. The incorporation of Magna Carta into English statute law during Henry III's reign gave it a legal status that transcended its origins as a peace treaty between John and his rebellious barons. The Charter became part of the fundamental law of England, establishing precedents and principles that would influence legal development for centuries to come. The influence of English constitutional traditions on the development of representative government in other parts of Europe and eventually in the New World ensured that the principles first articulated in Magna Carta would have global significance. The American colonists who invoked the rights of Englishmen in their conflicts with the British government were drawing on a tradition that could be traced back to Runnymede. The French revolutionaries who proclaimed the rights of man and citizen were influenced by English constitutional theory that had its roots in the conflicts of John's reign. The universal principles of human rights that emerged from the Enlightenment built upon foundations that had been laid in the struggles between medieval kings and their subjects. Modern democratic governments throughout the world have incorporated principles of limited government, due process, and the rule of law that can be traced to the constitutional innovations forced upon John by his rebellious barons. While the specific institutional forms have evolved dramatically, the underlying concepts remain remarkably consistent. The historical irony of John's legacy extends beyond his inadvertent contribution to constitutional development to include his influence on the evolution of English national identity. The king, who had lost the continental empire and reduced England to an offshore island, inadvertently helped to create the conditions for the emergence of a distinctly English political culture. The forced separation from continental territories that had defined Angevin identity compelled the English nobility to focus their attention on domestic affairs and develop institutions suited to governing an island kingdom. The loss of cross-channel connections that had characterized the period led to the gradual emergence of a more insular but also more cohesive English political community. John's conflicts with the Church, while temporarily disastrous for his immediate political position, also contributed to the long-term development of English independence from papal authority. The precedent of royal resistance to ecclesiastical interference established during the Interdict would be remembered and invoked by later kings who sought to limit papal influence in English affairs. The administrative innovations of John's reign, while initially unpopular because of their fiscal implications, provided the foundation for the sophisticated governmental machinery that would make England one of the most effectively governed kingdoms in medieval Europe. The bureaucratic procedures and record-keeping systems developed during his reign created a level of administrative efficiency that few contemporary kingdoms could match. The financial techniques pioneered by John's government, including systematic taxation of movable wealth and innovative approaches to royal revenue, established precedents that would influence fiscal policy for centuries. While his methods were often harsh and his demands excessive, the basic principles of royal finance that he developed became essential elements of medieval statecraft. The military innovations of John's reign, particularly his use of professional soldiers and siege engines, reflected broader changes in medieval warfare that would influence military development throughout Europe. His investment in castle building and fortification represented one of the largest construction programs of the medieval period and created defensive infrastructure that would serve England for centuries. Even John's failures had important historical consequences that extended far beyond his immediate political circumstances. The loss of Normandy ended the dual monarchy that had characterized English royal authority since the Norman conquest and forced English kings to develop new approaches to continental relations based on diplomacy rather than direct territorial control. The failure of John's continental campaigns demonstrated the limitations of medieval military power and the importance of political legitimacy in maintaining territorial control. No amount of military resources or administrative efficiency could compensate for the loss of popular support that followed from arbitrary rule and violations of accepted norms. The civil war and foreign invasion that marked the end of John's reign provided important lessons about the resilience of English political institutions and the capacity of the kingdom to survive even the most severe political crises. The peaceful resolution of these conflicts established precedents for the handling of future dynastic disputes and constitutional crises. As we reach the end of our journey through John's extraordinary life, we find ourselves confronting one of history's great paradoxes: a king universally despised by his contemporaries, who ultimately became one of the most important figures in the development of human freedom. His very failures created the conditions that made constitutional government possible, while his excesses provided the justification for limitations on royal authority that would influence political development throughout the world. The meadow at Runnymede, where an angry king was forced to accept restrictions on his power, became a sacred site in the geography of liberty. The document sealed there on that June day in 1215, initially dismissed by its creator as an unacceptable limitation on royal prerogative, became one of the most influential texts in human history. John's tomb in Worcester Cathedral bears an inscription that describes him as a king who enriched his clergy and people. While this epitaph would have seemed bitterly ironic to his contemporary subjects, who experienced only the harsh taxation and administrative oppression of his reign, it proved prophetic in ways that its medieval authors could never have imagined. The enrichment that John ultimately provided to his people was not material wealth, but constitutional heritage, the precious legacy of limited government, due process, and the rule of law that emerged from the wreckage of his reign. The king who sought to maximize royal authority became the instrument through which some of the most important restrictions on governmental power were established. In the quiet nave of Worcester Cathedral, where John's effigy lies surrounded by the symbols of earthly authority that he wielded so unsuccessfully in life, visitors can contemplate the strange alchemy by which historical failure was transformed into constitutional triumph. The man who was perhaps the most hated king in English history inadvertently became one of the greatest benefactors of human liberty. The bells that fell silent during the Interdict have long since resumed their ancient rhythm, calling the faithful to prayer as they have for nearly 8 centuries since John's death. But the constitutional principles born from his conflicts with his subjects continue to resonate across the centuries, ensuring that his true monument is not the stone effigy that marks his grave, but the living tradition of limited government that emerged from the crisis of his reign. As sleep carries you gently into dreams, remember that even in history's darkest moments, the seeds of progress may be quietly taking root. The failures of one generation often become the foundation for the achievements of the next, and the struggles of the past continue to shape the possibilities of the future. John Lackland lost his lands, but gave the world something far more precious: the enduring hope that power can be limited, that authority can be held accountable, and that even kings must bow before the law. In this way, the most despised monarch in English history became, through the mystery of historical consequence, one of the most important figures in the long struggle for human dignity and constitutional government. His legacy reminds us that progress often emerges from conflict, that justice may arise from injustice, and that the arc of history, however long and however painful, bends toward freedom.